Hello guys, welcome to Sleepumentary. Tonight we travel back to an age when the world was locked in ice, when survival wasn't just about endurance, but about invention, community, and imagination. So before we settle into the story, take a moment to get comfortable, slow your breathing, and if you like these journeys into the past, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, close your eyes and picture this. The wind howls at 40 below zero. Ice crystals whip through the air like tiny knives stinging any exposed skin. You're standing at the mouth of a cave somewhere in what will one day be called France. Snow piles high against the rocks and the horizon is nothing but a frozen white void. But look closer. This isn't the bleak image your schoolbooks once painted of desperate cave dwellers clinging to life. Inside, the glow of firelight flickers across the walls. A little girl giggles as her grandmother makes shadow animals with her hands, their shapes dancing on the stone like living myths. Men crouch near the fire, carefully sorting through smooth stone blanks that will become tomorrow's tools. Women work patiently with sinew threads, sewing waterproof seams so fine that even modern tailors would marvel at their precision. And in the center of it all, the smell of roasting mammoth fat drifts through the chamber. Not the last supper of a starving tribe, but tonight's hearty feast. It is 25,000 years ago, the time scientists call the last glacial maximum, the coldest, harshest episode in human memory. But here at this cave mouth, life is not only surviving, it is flourishing. These people are not the helpless caricatures of old cartoons. They are innovators, storytellers, and engineers of the Ice Age world. The scale of their challenge is almost unimaginable to us today. Imagine ice sheets 2 miles thick pressing down on the land from Scandinavia all the way to Scotland. Picture the sea dropping 400 feet, exposing hidden continents and ancient shorelines. Winters so bitter that the average temperature across Europe sat 15 degrees colder than it is now. To the south, the Sahara Desert bloomed into green grasslands dotted with lakes. In South America, the Amazon was no dense rainforest but an open plain. This was not just a cold spell, it was an alien planet sculpted by ice. For nearly 100,000 years, ice ages had come and gone. But beginning around 33,000 years ago, the climate didn't just dip, it collapsed. The world became a freezer, and the door slammed shut for the next 8,000 years. Scientists today call this period the last glacial maximum. For our ancestors, it was simply home, and yet what archaeologists find in the caves and open-air sites of Europe and Asia isn't the fossilized despair of starving people. It is the fingerprints of thriving communities. At Dolní Věstonice in today's Czech Republic, tiny ceramic figurines have been uncovered. The first evidence of humans firing clay not to store food but to make art. In the frozen steppes of Russia, houses made of hundreds of mammoth bones were arranged with such architectural precision that even modern builders are astonished by their design. The popular image of the caveman stooped, knuckle-dragging, mumbling is a pure fiction. These were artisans who painted masterpieces in the glow of firelight, traders who carried obsidian and seashells across continents, and survivors who engineered clothing and shelter against a climate that could kill in hours. Their story isn't one of bare survival, it's the greatest survival story never properly told. The Ice Age didn't just test humanity, it forged us. Every trait that makes us recognizably human, our creativity, our cooperation, our ability to imagine futures and turn them into reality was sharpened in the crucible of this frozen age. So tonight as you listen, imagine yourself among them. Not as a distant outsider, but as one of the band. A child warmed by reindeer pelts, a mother shaping thread from sinew, a hunter tracing animal tracks across the snow, or an elder weaving the night's lessons into stories for the young. This is their world, and for the next few hours, it will be ours too. Hey there! Before we go on, tap like and subscribe if these stories make you pause, reflect, or smile. And now tell me, where in the world are you joining me from tonight? And what hour has history found you at Earth? I want to hear your story. Picture Earth as you know it, oceans tracing their familiar shorelines, continents brimming with forests, deserts, and jungles. Now wipe that image clean. Imagine instead a planet remade by ice, a stranger's world that our ancestors called home. This was the last glacial maximum, the height of the Ice Age around 25,000 years ago. Start in Europe, colossal glaciers towered over the land so immense that if you stacked 10 Empire State Buildings one on top of the other, you still wouldn't reach their icy crowns. 2 miles thick, these frozen walls pressed down on the land, grinding mountains, flat-bearing valleys, and silencing entire ecosystems beneath crushing weight. Northern Europe was not a place of life. It was a world smothered in white students. Across the Atlantic, North America suffered a similar fate. Canada vanished beneath ice sheets that reached as far south as present-day Chicago and New York. Rivers rerouted forests, annihilated entire landscapes, erased under the frozen tide. From space, the planet would have looked like it had grown new continents made entirely of ice, and yet paradoxically, where some regions were swallowed by glaciers, others bloomed with unexpected life. Because the oceans had retreated locked away in frozen sheets, sea levels dropped more than 400 feet. The world map shifted dramatically. Vast continental shelves emerged from the oceans, revealing grasslands where seas once rolled. Imagine Britain still welded to continental Europe, or dry land stretching from Siberia to Alaska. Entire lost worlds lay open, waiting for human footprints. The Sahara Desert, which we imagine today as endless dunes, was transformed into a green corridor watered by rivers and dotted with lakes that shimmered under the pale Ice Age sun. Herds of gazelle and other animals roamed there, followed closely by hunters. To the west, the mighty Amazon basin, now dense with humidity and tangled rainforest, was instead a sprawling grassland, more like African savanna than tropical jungle. What we consider permanent was in truth fleeting. But these changes brought harsh consequences. Across Europe, the average annual temperature plunged about 15 degrees colder than today. 15 degrees may sound small, but it was enough to turn fertile valleys into tundra, enough to shorten growing seasons into nothing, enough to erase forests that had taken millennia to grow. Imagine a land where summer feels like winter, where even the warmest months never allow true comfort. This wasn't just weather, it was an alien climate system. Winds howled differently, carrying dust storms across entire continents. Skies often stayed clear and sharp, the air dry and brittle. In Siberia, paradoxically, snowfall was lighter than Chicago's average today, leaving vast expanses cold but accessible. In contrast, Western Europe battled blizzards and deep snowpacks that never fully melted. The planet's balance was broken, turned into a patchwork of extremes. For humans, this meant a constant dance between opportunity and annihilation. Where glaciers crushed the land, no one could live. But on the edges, life found footholds, grasslands where mammoths and bison grazed rivers that still flowed, caves that offered shelter from the storms. These were the borderlands of survival where every step demanded calculation and every mistake could mean death. And yet here's the remarkable truth: our ancestors did not merely endure this alien Earth, they thrived upon it. The brutality of the climate became the canvas for their ingenuity. They learned to exploit the patchwork fishing in rivers fed by glacial melt, hunting on the vast steppes revealed by retreating seas, crafting shelters and clothing suited to each microclimate. They learned that survival wasn't about resisting the cold, but about mastering it. So as you picture this frozen world, towering walls of ice to the North Emerald deserts to the south, grasslands where rainforests should be, remember that it wasn't a barren wasteland. It was a place of extremes, a place where creativity became as essential as breath. It was harsh, yes, but also astonishingly beautiful in its alien strangeness. And into this remade Earth, humans carved their destiny. Step into a windswept valley in what is now the Czech Republic. Snow drifts across the ground, but inside a low shelter, something extraordinary is taking shape. Not a spear, not a tool for hunting, but a figurine, small, fragile, made of clay. Someone has carefully moulded it, then set it into a fire to harden. Archaeologists call these the Venus figurines of Dolní Věstonice, dated to around 26,000 years ago. They are the world's earliest known ceramics, created not to store food or water, but as works of art and perhaps symbols of fertility, protection, or identity. In a time when survival supposedly consumed every waking hour, people invested effort in beauty, meaning, and ritual. Move east to the icy plains of Russia. Here, archaeologists have uncovered entire villages built from mammoth bones. At Mezhyrich in Ukraine, 4 such houses were found, each one constructed from the remains of dozens of mammoths. Skulls formed the foundation, tusks acted as arches, and massive shoulder blades were leaned like shingles to block the wind. These weren't crude piles of bones, they were engineered structures requiring coordination, planning, and strength. Imagine the sheer labour transporting bones weighing hundreds of pounds without wheels or beasts of burden, then fitting them together with architectural precision. Some houses even included decorative carvings and evidence of paintproof that these were not just shelters, but homes filled with human intention and care. Inside those shelters, life flourished. Hearths were carefully placed for warmth and light. Pits dug into the permafrost served as natural refrigerators, storing food through the long months of scarcity. Tools lay scattered across work areas, blades for scraping hides, awls for piercing leather, flint cores ready to be struck into new implements. It was an organized, lived-in world, the domestic heartbeat of Ice Age humanity. The stereotype of the caveman crumbles here. These people were not solitary brutes dragging clubs. They were part of networks stretching across continents. Obsidian from far-off volcanoes turns up hundreds of miles from its source. Shell beads from Mediterranean shores appear deep inland. Baltic amber glows in burials far to the south. Every artifact is a whisper of long-distance exchange proof of social and trade networks far more complex than once imagined. And then there is the art. In caves across Europe, flickering firelight brought walls to life with painted horses, mammoths, lions and aurochs, but artistry wasn't confined to deep chambers. Engraved ivory, carved bone flutes, decorated tools and personal ornaments tell of a society that valued beauty as much as survival. A necklace of fox teeth wasn't just adornment, it was identity, a signal of belonging, perhaps even of alliance across distant groups. These archaeological sites remind us of something profound. Even in the most brutal conditions, humans did not live only to endure. They lived to create, to connect, to express themselves in forms that would outlast their own lifetimes. Their shelters were not just defenses against the cold, they were expressions of engineering genius. Their tools were not just weapons, they were canvases for creativity. Their ornaments and figurines were not just pretty trinkets, they were threads in a tapestry of meaning binding communities together across thousands of miles. The Ice Age has often been imagined as an age of silence, but the evidence says otherwise. It was alive with music, trade, colour and art. Communities in stone and bone carried knowledge forward through generations, transforming mere survival into something richer, a life that recognized beauty, memory, and hope even in a frozen world. In the frozen soil of Russia near the banks of the Klyazma River lies a site that rewrites what we thought we knew about the Ice Age. This is Sungira burial ground, more than 30,000 years old. At first glance, it seems impossible in a world where survival meant constant battle against hunger and cold. Why would anyone spend thousands of hours adorning the dead? Yet here, beneath layers of earth and ivory, we glimpse a truth that is both haunting and profoundly human. The most famous burial is that of an elderly man, thought to be over 60 years old, a remarkable age for the Upper Paleolithic. He was interred wearing a garment covered in more than 3,000 ivory beads, each one carved from mammoth tusk. Creating those beads was no small task. To make just one required an hour of careful drilling, polishing and shaping. To complete the elder's outfit, someone invested over 2,500 hours of labour. That is more than a year's worth of full-time work given freely not to feed the living, but to honour the dead. Nearby, 2 children were buried head-to-head in a double grave. They were given even more lavish offerings, thousands of beads, spears carved from mammoth ivory, and ornaments that must have marked them as extraordinary within their community. One of them, only about 10 years old, was buried with a spear taller than himself, as if to arm him for journeys beyond this world. What does this mean? Archaeologists argue over the details, but one fact is undeniable. These burials were not about necessity. They were about ritual identity and belief. Time that could have been spent hunting or sewing or repairing shelters was instead devoted to symbolism. It tells us that Ice Age people valued more than mere survival. They valued meaning, memory, and the unseen threads that bound them to one another. And Sungir is not unique. Across Europe and Asia, burials tell a similar story. In Italy's Grotta Pellicci, red ochre stains the bones of the dead, symbolic pigment used for tens of thousands of years. In Dolny Vestonica, a woman with scoliosis, her spine curved and twisted, was buried with care, covered in ochre, her body positioned deliberately. In the Middle East, at Shanidar Cave, Neanderthals, our close cousins, had already buried their dead with flowers and herbs, suggesting beliefs about life beyond the grave. Even the grave goods themselves tell stories. Beads, pendants, carved figures and tools buried with the deceased were not only offerings but also lessons. They whispered, "This is who we were, this is what we valued. Remember us," to be laid to rest with ornaments and tools, was to be woven into a story larger than one life. Imagine the funerals. A band of perhaps 30 people gathers in the firelight. The elder's body, dressed in garments glittering with ivory, is carried into the grave. Children watch wide-eyed as ochre is sprinkled across the body like a blessing, the red dust glowing in the torchlight. Someone sings, perhaps softly, perhaps with trembling voice. Spears and ornaments are laid gently beside the dead. It is not just mourning, it is teaching. Each burial a reminder to the living that their people mattered, that they were not alone in the cold, that even death could be met with dignity. For us, the lesson is stark. These communities gave to their dead not out of luxury but out of conviction. They knew that survival was not only about bodies, it was about stories, identity and continuity. To forget their dead would have been a greater death than any winter could bring. In the Ice Age, when the line between life and extinction was razor thin, our ancestors invested precious hours in honouring one another. They carved beads, painted bodies and buried children with spears too heavy for them to lift. They told the world, we are more than animals, we are human. Imagine this, the world is thawing. For thousands of years, the great ice sheets have been retreating, their grip on Europe and North America loosening. Forests are creeping northward. Rivers flow stronger. Fish spawn in abundance. And wild grasses wave in the wind where once only permafrost lay. To your grandparents who grew up in the deepest freeze of the last glacial maximum, this feels like a miracle. Their stories of endless snow are fading into memory. You believe your children will never know that kind of cold. And then, in a span shorter than one human lifetime, everything collapses. This is the story of the Younger Dryas, a climate catastrophe that struck around 900 years ago. Scientists describe it as one of the most abrupt climate reversals in Earth's history, a sudden plunge back into glacial conditions just as humanity had begun to breathe easier. The numbers defy belief. In Greenland, ice cores tell the tale with frozen precision, an initial temperature drop of about 5 degrees, within only a few years followed by an additional 10 degrees of cooling. Imagine New York's climate shifting to resemble northern Alaska's in the time it takes a child to grow up. The evidence shows it didn't happen slowly. It was as if the planet's thermostat was yanked violently downward. We have witnesses, though they left no written words. In the ancient sediments of Abu Huraira, a site in modern Syria, archaeologists discovered layers of pollen grains, tiny time capsules recording the landscape's transformation. Below, the evidence of paradise rye wheat and lush vegetation. Above, in the layers corresponding to the Younger Dryas, the plants vanish. Trees retreat, wild grasses collapse, and desert shrubs take their place. In a single human generation, fertile land turned into frozen tundra. For the villagers, the impact was catastrophic. Their familiar foods vanished. Herds changed migration patterns. What had been abundance became famine. Faced with starvation, people did something radical. They invented agriculture. Those who once gathered wild cereals now began planting them deliberately. For the first time, seeds were not only food, but also hope carefully sown against the cruel odds of survival. Scientists still debate what triggered this frozen apocalypse. The leading theory begins in North America, where massive glacial lakes had pooled along the edges of the retreating ice sheets. One of these Lake Agassiz was larger than all of today's Great Lakes combined. When an ice dam finally gave way, it unleashed a flood of fresh water into the North Atlantic, an event so vast that it altered the ocean's circulation. The conveyor belt of warm currents that carried heat to Europe collapsed, and with it the fragile warming of the planet. Within years, perhaps even months, the climate system crashed like a computer hitting a fatal error. The Younger Dryas lasted 300 years. To put that in perspective, that's longer than the span from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance. For generation after generation, humans lived in a world locked once more in ice, their brief glimpse of warmth cruelly stolen. Entire cultures buckled under the shock. In North America, the Clovis culture master mammoth hunters known for their finely fluted spear points simply vanished from the archaeological record. One century they were everywhere, the next gone, and yet out of this extinction others adapted. The Folsom people emerged with more refined weapons. Coastal groups turned to the sea. Human beings once again proved that the secret to survival was not brute strength, but imagination. The Younger Dryas teaches us a sobering truth. Climate does not always change gradually. It can snap like a twig underfoot, altering entire ecosystems in less time than it takes to pass down a story. Our ancestors endured a winter that returned without warning and lasted more than a millennium, and though many cultures collapsed, humanity did not. We adapted, inventing new ways of living in the shadow of catastrophe. It was not the end of the world, but for those who lived through it, it must have felt like the end of everything they had ever known. Imagine standing on a wind-swept plain in what is now northern Syria about 12,000 years ago. The cold of the Younger Dryas has returned with merciless speed. Just a few generations earlier, this land was green, its riverbanks heavy with wild wheat and rye, its meadows bursting with fruit and game. But now the warmth is gone, the wheat no longer ripens where it once grew. Herds migrate differently. Families return to familiar gathering spots only to find them barren. This is Abu Huraira, a small settlement on the banks of the Euphrates. For centuries its people had thrived as hunter-gatherers. They gathered wild cereals in woven baskets, pounding the seas into flour with heavy grinding stones. They hunted gazelles, fished in the river, and collected berries and nuts. Life was demanding, but the land was generous. And then the climate shifted. Archaeologists reading the soil of Abu Huraira have uncovered a tragedy written in pollen. The evidence shows that within a single lifetime, fertile plains became near deserts. Wild cereals that once sprouted thickly now dwindled to scattered stalks. The survival strategy that had sustained countless generations no longer worked. Hunger stalked the camp. Faced with this desperation, the people of Abu Huraira tried something new, something no human group had done before, at least not on this scale. Instead of roaming to find food, they began to alter the land itself. They planted the seeds of wild wheat and rye near their homes. They watered them, weeded them, and harvested them deliberately. It was not yet farming. As we know it, it was fragile, experimental, and born out of necessity, but it was the spark of a transformation. The archaeological evidence is striking. The grinding stones found at Abu Huraira show wear far heavier than earlier ones, proof of daily relentless grain processing. The skeletal remains of the villagers tell a harsher story, teeth worn down to stubs from grit in their bread spines, bent from long hours of grinding, and shorter lifespans compared to their ancestors. Farming was not a gentle invention. It was grueling labour forced upon people by starvation. And yet this desperate gamble worked. Slowly the wild cereals changed. When humans saved the fattest seeds and replanted them, they nudged nature in a new direction. Over generations the wheat grew larger, the rye hardier. Without realizing it, the villagers of Abu Huraira had launched the first great human experiment in domestication. They were reshaping plants, bending the natural world to their will. This innovation did not spread overnight. For centuries, farming and foraging coexisted. Families still hunted and gathered when they could. But when harvests succeeded, they found something new: security. A surplus of food, however small, meant the ability to survive another harsh season. It meant children with better odds of reaching adulthood. It meant that life could be planned instead of gambled against the weather. The irony is profound. Agriculture, the foundation of cities, empires, and civilizations, was not invented in comfort. It was not born out of curiosity. It was forced out of desperation. With wild foods vanishing, the people of Abu Huraira turned necessity into innovation. Looking back, it's tempting to call this a triumph. But for those who lived it, the transition must have felt like loss. Hunting parties dwindled. Old gathering routes, once rich with plants, were abandoned. The songs that told where to find wild grains grew obsolete. In their place came back-breaking, work-aching muscles and bread so coarse it cracked teeth. And yet this pivot, this gamble against extinction, set humanity onto a course that would reshape the earth. From the furrows scratched in Abu Huraira's soil grew fields, villages, kingdoms, and eventually the modern world. Desperation became invention, and invention became destiny. When scientists first drilled into the Greenland ice sheet and pulled out mile-long cores of frozen history, they expected to see climate shifts spread across centuries. Instead, they found something terrifying: an abrupt crash, a sudden cooling so fast it could be measured in human lifetimes. The event is now called the Younger Dryas, and one leading theory reads like the plot of a disaster film. At the end of the Ice Age, as glaciers retreated across North America, they left behind vast meltwater lakes, giants so large they defy imagination. The greatest of these was Lake Agassiz, a body of water larger than all 5 Great Lakes combined. It sprawled across the heart of the continent, trapped behind fragile walls of ice. For centuries it grew, swelling silently. Then sometime around 12 to 900 years ago, the dam broke. The collapse unleashed a torrent of freshwater unmatched in modern history. Picture every river on Earth flowing at once, magnified 100-fold, pouring into the North Atlantic. This flood didn't just drown valleys, it rewired the planet's climate system. Here's why. Earth's heat engine depends on ocean currents, especially the Atlantic's great conveyor belt, the thermohaline circulation. Warm water from the tropics flows northward, releases heat to Europe, then sinks as it cools and returns southward in a global loop. It's this invisible conveyor that keeps Europe's climate mild and the world's seasons in balance. But fresh water is lighter than salt water. When Lake Agassiz poured its deluge into the Atlantic, it diluted the ocean's salinity, preventing that warm water from sinking. The conveyor belt stalled. The result was chaos. Europe froze. The Middle East withered. Monsoons across Africa faltered. Within years, maybe even months, weather systems buckled as if the planet had suffered a heart attack. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere plunged by as much as 15 degrees. Whole forests died in a single generation. Herds that had wandered familiar routes for centuries suddenly found their paths erased. Not all scientists agree on the details. Some point instead to a comet impact citing mysterious layers of microscopic glassy spherules and nanodiamonds found in younger, drier sediments. Others argue for volcanic eruptions or complex feedback loops in the atmosphere. But the Lake Agassiz flood remains the most widely supported culprit, a single colossal outburst reshaping the climate of an entire hemisphere. Imagine being alive then. Your grandparents told stories of a warming Earth, of rivers flowing and plants blooming farther north each year. You saw forests creeping into tundra valleys, and then without warning the warmth vanished. The rivers froze, the plants died, the winds turned sharp again. For your people, it must have felt like betrayal and apocalypse, not written in fire but in ice and silence. To modern eyes, the Younger Dryas is a reminder of Earth's fragility. We tend to imagine the climate as a stable background shifting slowly and predictably. But the past tells a harsher truth. The climate is not a dial, it is a switch. And when it flips fast. Our ancestors endured that crash. They did not understand the physics of thermohaline circulation or the mechanics of a freshwater flood in the Atlantic. But they felt the consequences in their bones, their bellies, their stories. They watched the world transform into in a single lifetime and were forced to adapt or vanish. Across the open plains of North America, the Clovis people once thrived. They were master hunters, famous for their sleek stone points, thin-fluted, and so finely crafted that modern knappers still struggle to replicate them. These were not crude weapons. They were the Ferraris of the Stone Age toolkit, hafted onto spears and used to bring down mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison. For centuries, Clovis hunters spread from Alaska to Mexico, leaving behind a trail of campsites and kills that seemed to announce their dominance over the continent. And then, without warning, they vanished. Archaeologists digging through ancient soil layers often encounter what they call the black mat. This dark band of sediment marks the onset of the Younger Dryas. Below it, Clovis spear points and mammoth bones are everywhere. Above it, they are gone. It's as if someone had erased the Clovis culture from the continent's story. No slow decline, no fading traces, just silence. For decades, scholars debated what happened. Some blamed overhunting, imagining the Clovis had wiped out the very megafauna they depended on. Others pointed to the Younger Dryas when climate crashed, and mammoths and mastodons lost their grazing grounds. Recent research suggests a grim combination ecosystems buckled under abrupt cooling, and with the great herds dwindling, the hunters who had specialized in pursuing them were left without prey. But here is the revelation: humanity did not vanish with Clovis. Instead, new cultures emerged, each adapted to the new world the Younger Dryas had created. In the Great Plains, the Folsom people rose from the shadows of Clovis. Their tools were even more delicate, finer, fluting sharper edges designed not for mammoth, but for the smaller, swifter bison that now dominated the grasslands. At Folsom, New Mexico, archaeologists uncovered the remains of 23 bison, each one struck with precision by these refined points. It was not a desperate last hunt, but proof of mastery over a new way of life. Along the coasts, other groups turned away from hunting giant land animals altogether. They looked to the sea. Archaeological sites from California's Channel Islands to the shores of South America reveal a shift-shell middens, piled high fish bones in abundance, harpoons and net weights replacing mammoth bone spearheads. Where mammoth hunters faltered, maritime peoples flourished, learning tides, currents and the secrets of spawning runs. This was resilience written in stone and bone. The disappearance of Clovis was not an end, but a transformation. One culture tied to the fate of giant beasts collapsed. Others, flexible and inventive, stepped forward. It is a pattern that echoes across prehistory catastrophe, forcing creativity. When the great mammoths fell, people learned to hunt bison. When herds grew scarce, people turned to rivers and seas. When grasslands failed, they began cultivating the seeds that clung to survival. The story of Clovis is not just about disappearance. It is about the rebirth of humanity in new forms adapted to new challenges. For the people who lived through it, the change must have felt apocalyptic. The spear points that had fed generations were suddenly useless. Traditions tied to mammoth hunts became memories. Yet within a century or two, children grew up learning different ways how to fish the rivers, how to stalk smaller game, how to chip finer, lighter points. The archaeological record is clear. The younger dryas didn't just destroy it, reshaped. It pruned away the brittle, but in doing so it left space for the resilient to grow. Humanity survived not by clinging to the old, but by daring to invent the new. If you were to fly above the earth at the height of the Ice Age, the view would confuse you. Some regions looked utterly lifeless, buried under mountains of ice. Others shimmered with life, vast green and brown steppes thrumming with herds. The planet wasn't one thing, it was a mosaic, a patchwork planet of extremes. To the north, glaciers ruled. In Europe, ice sheets smothered Scandinavia and pressed deep into Germany and Poland. Britain was unrecognizable, a white plateau locked beneath thousands of feet of frozen weight. Across the Atlantic, the Laurentide ice sheet blanketed Canada and reached down into the northern United States. These were not friendly places. They were deserts of ice, their silence broken only by the groan of glaciers grinding rock to dust, and no forest, no grass, no animals could survive there. But push south only a few hundred miles and the picture changes completely. The land bursts into the mammoth steppe biome unlike anything alive today. Stretching from France across Siberia and into Alaska, it was the most productive ecosystem of the Ice Age. Imagine open grasslands dotted with flowers in summer, snow-swept plains in winter, but always alive with movement. Herds of mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison and wild horses grazed in numbers rivaling modern Africa's Serengeti. Lions prowled, wolves hunted in packs. Humans followed, thriving in this strange paradox: frozen earth, but fertile plains. That contrast was the key. Where glaciers destroyed steppes provided. Where cold killed forests, grasslands flourished. The Ice Age didn't create a single uniform environment. It carved the world into zones, each demanding different survival strategies. Even stranger, some of the driest places were not deserts of sand, but polar deserts, cold barren expanses where snow rarely fell. Parts of Siberia were like this, bone-dry, windswept, yet still grazed by herds of hardy animals. Other areas like Western Europe were hammered by endless snow, forcing people into caves and shelters for months at a time. This patchwork extended beyond land. With so much water locked in ice, sea levels dropped by more than 400 feet, exposing entire continents. Britain wasn't an island, but a peninsula of Europe. Japan was connected to Korea. Australia stretched into Tasmania. And across the north, the vast land of Beringia bridged Siberia and Alaska, a dry grassland the size of a country. What is now ocean floor was then hunting ground. For humans, this uneven world was both opportunity and danger. Wander too far north and you entered the lifeless grip of glaciers. Settle in the wrong valley and snow would bury you for half the year. But follow the steppes and you found abundance herds to hunt rivers, to fish berries, to gather in summer. Success depended on knowing not just the land, but the subtle borders between survival and oblivion. Imagine being a child born into this world. One season you watch herds of horses thunder across the plains, your elders chasing them with spears and laughter. Another season, a hunting party strays too far north and vanishes into the white. Stories at night are not just entertainment, they are maps of memory, warnings, and wisdom about where life can be found and where death waits. The Ice Age. Earth was never simple. It was a planet of juxtapositions, ice walls beside fertile plains, deserts of cold beside rivers full of fish, lands that were here today and oceans tomorrow. That patchwork forced humanity to become expert navigators of extremes, adapting not to one world but to many worlds stitched together. And perhaps that is why our species endured. We learned not to see the Earth as uniform, but as a quilt of contrasts demanding flexibility, memory, and imagination. In a sense, we still live on that patchwork planet today, only the patterns have shifted. Close your eyes and picture a land that no map today shows. A world where Siberia and Alaska are not divided by sea, but joined by a broad plain of grass and tundra. This is Beringia, a lost country the size of modern Mexico, revealed when sea levels dropped more than 400 feet during the Ice Age. Today, the Bering Strait stretches 50 miles across its waters, churning with icy currents. But for tens of thousands of years, there was no strait, only land, wind and life. Beringia was not just a bridge, it was a homeland. Archaeologists and geneticists now believe that human groups lived there for millennia, trapped between massive ice sheets to the east and frozen Siberia to the west. They call this the Beringian standstill hypothesis, that for thousands of years small bands of people survived in this refuge waiting for the ice to retreat so they could move deeper into the Americas. Imagine the scene. Grassy plains stretched toward horizons of ice. Steppe, bison, woolly mammoths and horses grazed in herds. Caribou migrated in endless streams, their hooves drumming the earth. Humans built shelters of bone and hide, hunted with finely made points and tended fires that glowed in the Arctic twilight. Children learned to carve tools from ivory, to read tracks in snow, to listen for the calls of migrating birds. This was not a windswept no man's land, it was a country of memory and belonging. The genetic evidence is compelling. Nearly all indigenous peoples of the Americas trace their ancestry back to a small founding population, perhaps only a few thousand individuals who weathered the harsh millennia in Beringia. From this bottleneck, entire continents would one day be peopled. North America, Central America, South America, all seeded by the endurance of those who called Beringia home, and yet it was a land that demanded resilience. Summers has brought bursts of green and swarms of insects, but winters were long and dark with icy winds sweeping off the glaciers. Resources were seasonal, requiring memory and cooperation. Salmon runs had to be timed perfectly. Herd migrations had to be anticipated. The line between feast and famine was thin, and survival required both skill and trust. For generations, people looked eastward at the towering walls of ice that blocked the way into the Americas. They must have wondered what lies beyond. They told stories of new hunting grounds, of lands waiting for them. And then slowly the glaciers began to retreat. By around 15,000 years ago, coastal routes opened and some groups moved south, following shorelines rich with kelp forests and marine life. Others pushed through ice-free corridors that slowly opened in the heart of the continent. When they did, they carried Beringia with them, not just in their genes, but in their traditions, technologies and stories. Every arrowhead chipped, every fire lit, every lullaby sung to a child carried the echo of that lost world. Today the land bridge lies hidden beneath cold waters erased by rising seas. But in the DNA of millions, and in the oral histories of indigenous nations, Beringia endures. It was not just a passage, it was a cradle, a place where humanity paused, endured, and prepared to fill two continents. The lost world of Beringia reminds us of a profound truth. Sometimes survival means waiting. Patience can be as powerful as courage. For thousands of years, our ancestors waited in that frozen land until the earth shifted, and the door finally opened. If you enjoyed this moment, leave a comment with the number 1 below, so I know you're still here with me. If you could stand on the open plains of Ice Age Eurasia 20,000 years ago, you might think you'd been transported to Africa. The horizon ripples with movement. Herds stretch as far as the eye can see, mammoths lumbering with their shaggy coats, bison, snorting clouds of steam into the frigid air, wild horses galloping in tight bands. In the distance, woolly rhinoceroses trudge through snow while saiga antelope flicker like shadows across the steppe. This was the mammoth steppe, the richest ecosystem of the Ice Age, and perhaps the most productive grassland Earth has ever known. Scientists sometimes call it the Pleistocene Serengeti, but that comparison undersells its scale. In terms of biomass, the total weight of animals living on the land, it may have surpassed even Africa's modern savannas. From France across Siberia to Alaska, nearly unbroken grasslands supported dense populations of megafauna. The key was not warmth but grass. Hardy Ice Age grasses thrived in the cold, converting scarce sunlight into food that could fuel vast herds. Where forests would have withered in freezing winds, grasslands endured, spreading like a green carpet beneath the snow. For predators, it was a paradise. Packs of wolves shadowed the herds. Lions larger than their modern African cousins prowled the plains. Scimitar-toothed cats stalked with silent precision, their fangs flashing in ambush. Even humans were just one predator among many, testing their skill against animals 10 times their size. Yet humans did not merely compete here. they thrived. Archaeological sites across the steppe reveal butchering marks on mammoth bones, carefully designed hunting camps and shelters built from hides and tusks. Hunters developed tools and strategies suited to this vast ecosystem, at ladles to launch spears, farther-fluted points to pierce thick hides, and persistence hunts where endurance mattered more than brute force. But the mammoth steppe wasn't only a supermarket of meat. It provided skins for clothing, bones for tools, fat for fuel, and sinew for sewing. Mammoth ivory became a medium for art, carved beads, beer figurines, and even musical instruments. Humans weren't just feeding their bodies here, they were feeding their imaginations. Life on the steppe demanded mobility. Following the herds meant moving camps seasonally, building lightweight shelters, and carrying traditions rather than possessions. Children learned to walk on endless horizons, their lullabies carried on the wind. Elders became living libraries, remembering migration routes, seasonal cycles, and the habits of animals. Knowledge itself was a survival tool passed like fire from one generation to the next. And while danger lurked everywhere, one misstep could turn a hunt into disaster. The rewards were immense. A single mammoth, if taken down, could feed dozens of people for weeks, its hide sewn into clothing, its bones into tools, its fat rendered into oil. For bands who mastered the steppe, life could be abundant, even luxurious by Ice Age standards. Standing in that world, you would not see a bleak wasteland of snow. You would see movement, colour and vitality, golden grasses poking through frost-dark herds, pressing against pale horizons, predators circling, and humans moving in rhythm with it all. The mammoth steppe was more than an ecosystem, it was a stage. On it, humanity learned to adapt, to cooperate, to innovate. It was a proving ground where survival meant balance. Take too much and the herds would vanish. Take too little and you would starve. The lessons carved into that frozen grassland would echo into every future society: the art of mobility, the necessity of memory, and the truth that abundance and fragility always walk hand in hand. Imagine standing on the banks of the Yana River in Siberia, where the winds sweep down from the frozen tundra and the sun disappears for months at a time. Today, this land is inhospitable, even with modern technology, yet 32,000 years ago, long before insulated parkas or snowmobiles, humans not only passed through this place, they stayed. The Yana settlement at 71 degrees north latitude, nearly 500 miles above the Arctic Circle, remains one of the most astonishing archaeological discoveries of the Ice Age. This was not a temporary hunting camp hastily built and abandoned. Excavations reveal thousands of artifacts, tools, ornaments, and the remains of structures that speak of long-term habitation. Hearths were carefully maintained. Mammoth bones formed the framework for sturdy dwellings, insulated against the relentless cold. Hunters here weren't wandering nomads, but residents of the high Arctic. A deliberate choice, not an accident of migration. Why would anyone move so far into the teeth of the cold? The answer lies in abundance. The so-called polar desert was in fact teeming with life. Herds of mammoth, bison, horse, and reindeer grazed on the mammoth steppe's nutritious grasses. Predators prowled, yes, but their presence confirmed the richness of the ecosystem. For skilled hunters, Yana offered not just survival, but stability. A predictable supply of meat, hides, bone, and fat. The people of Yana didn't simply scrape by, they innovated. Archaeologists uncovered intricately carved ivory objects, beads, and even engraved plaques. Some artifacts suggest symbolic or spiritual meaning, hinting that art and ritual flourished even under Arctic skies. A carved bird figurine small enough to fit in the palm still carries the delicate details of its feathers. In a world where every calorie mattered, they devoted hours, days, even to works of creativity. Their technology was equally advanced. Needle fragments, awls, and sinew threads point to tailored clothing layered for extreme cold. Imagine a child dressed in ground squirrel furs, each pelt carefully stitched into a mosaic of warmth. Adults likely wore reindeer and wolverine furs, chosen not just for insulation, but for their ability to resist frost. These weren't crude hides thrown over shoulders, they were engineered garments, Arctic armor crafted with bone needles and human patience. But perhaps most telling is the evidence of community. To thrive this far north required cooperation. Hunters brought in game too large for a single family to process. Toolmakers maintained a constant supply of weapons and clothing. Elders carried memory, the knowledge of migration patterns, ice conditions, and which riverbanks offered shelter in the wind. Survival here wasn't individual achievement, it was collective mastery. The Yana settlement proves something profound. Humans didn't simply adapt to the Arctic, they chose it. They looked at one of Earth's most forbidding landscapes and saw not a death trap but a home. Where other species retreated, we advanced. Where the cold tried to crush life, we built fires, stitched clothing and carved symbols into ivory. Standing at Yana's latitude today, you might feel the silence pressing in the vast white horizon, broken only by shadow. But 32,000 years ago, that silence rang with laughter, stories and songs. It was proof of a daring truth that humanity was no longer bound by climate's leash. We were becoming architects of possibility, reshaping our relationship with the planet itself. Picture the Earth not as you know it, but as it appeared 20,000 years ago. The ice had locked away so much water that sea levels plummeted by nearly 400 feet. Oceans shrank, and in their retreat they revealed something extraordinary, a planet stitched together by bridges of land. In Europe, the chalk-white cliffs of Dover did not look across a watery channel toward France, they were connected. Britain wasn't an island, but an extension of the continent, its rivers flowing seamlessly into those of the Low Countries. Forests and grassy plains stretched where ferries now cross. Herds of red deer, bison and wild horses wandered freely, their migrations unconstrained by coasts. Humans too walked between what we now call nations, carrying tools, ornaments and stories across a landscape long vanished beneath the waves. Farther east, Japan wasn't an archipelago but a peninsula. Land bridged Honshu to Korea and from there to the Asian mainland. Imagine the first Paleolithic travellers, standing where the Sea of Japan now rolls, gazing not at surf and horizon, but at forests and steppe stretching away. The cultural exchanges this permitted, stone tool traditions, hunting techniques, genetic mingling are recorded in the archaeological record. What feels like isolation today was once integration. Australia too looked very different. With lower seas, the landmass of Sahul connected Tasmania, the Australian continent and New Guinea into one enormous island continent. Aboriginal ancestors could walk from what is now Darwin to Port Moresby, or from Melbourne to Hobart without ever seeing an ocean. Their trade networks expanded across this vast plateau, carrying ochre shell ornaments and plant knowledge. Rock art in Arnhem Land shows depictions of animals long extinct, reminders of a time when inland deserts were savannas alive with life. Even the Indonesian archipelago today, fragmented into thousands of islands, had been drawn together. Java, Sumatra and Borneo were all part of Sunda, a continental shelf revealed as a sprawling extension of Southeast Asia. Here, dense forests and rivers became corridors of human and animal migration. Archaeologists believe this was one of the key stepping stones that allowed early humans to spread eastward toward Australia tens of thousands of years before. Perhaps the most famous of all these ghost landscapes was Beringia, the 1,000-mile-wide grassland bridge between Siberia and Alaska. But Beringia was not unique. It was simply one of many doorways the Ice Age unlocked. To imagine this world is to see Earth transformed. Continents were larger distances, shorter borders non-existent. The seas we take for granted as permanent barriers were in the grand span of time, temporary floods. For tens of millennia, humanity lived in a world of hidden continents, walking routes now buried beneath waves. And yet those drowned highways shaped everything that came after. When the ice melted and seas returned, they sealed off communities that had once mingled. Britain became an island. Japan became an archipelago. Australia drifted into isolation. Languages diverged, cultures branched, species evolved apart. What the Ice Age joined together, the Holocene seas tore apart. Next time you stand at a coastline, imagine not the endless horizon of water, but the ghost of a land road beneath the waves. Our ancestors walked there. They hunted, they traded, they fell in love. Their footprints lie buried under centuries of tides. The oceans conceal them now, but the memory of that connected world lingers in our DNA, in our artifacts, and in the shape of history itself. In the glow of a fire, a woman sits cross-legged on the packed earth. Her hands steady with their practice cradle a sliver of bone. It is no larger than a finger, but polished smooth and pierced with a tiny hole. This is the eyed needle, a tool so unassuming you might dismiss it as scrap. Yet with it, Ice Age humanity unlocked survival in some of the harshest climates the world has ever known. Before the needle clothing was crude hides draped across shoulders, tied with thongs or pinned with bone awls. Effective in mild weather, yes, but in the killing winds of the last glacial maximum, gaps, opened seams, leaked snow crept in. At -40, exposure was measured in minutes. Without something better, The expansion into Europe, Siberia, and the Arctic would have been impossible. The eyed needle changed everything. With sinew thread pulled through that tiny hole, hides could be pierced and stitched edge to edge, creating sealed seams that stopped both wind and water. Garments could be tailored, not simply wrapped. They could fit close to the body, eliminating deadly air gaps. They could be layered, each piece with a function: a soft inner layer of bird skins to wick away moisture, a middle layer of reindeer fur for insulation, and an outer shell of wolf or wolverine, their guard hairs shedding snow and frost. Archaeological finds confirm the sophistication. At Denisova Cave in Siberia, needles appear as early as 50,000 years ago, some so fine they rival modern steel in delicacy. At sites across Europe, specialized needles proliferated: thick ivory needles for heavy parkas, swan bone needles for fine stitching, and ultra-delicate rabbit bone needles for decorative or child-sized garments. This wasn't improvisation, it was industry backed by knowledge of which animal furs worked best and how to process each hide. Consider reindeer fur, where each hollow hair trapping warmth like fiberglass insulation. A parka of reindeer weighed only a few pounds but could outperform 20 pounds of wool. Wolverine fur chosen for hood ruffs resisted frosting from breath, something Arctic explorers still prize today. Ground squirrels with pelts cut into dozens of tiny panels made lightweight coats for children, their seams a miniature echo of adult clothing. Every stitch represented hours of labour, yet also lifetimes of accumulated wisdom, and it wasn't just about survival. Clothing became identity. Beads sewn into hems, coloured trims along sleeves, or intricate patterns of fur created visual codes, perhaps marking clan lineage or status. The man buried at Sungir in Russia wore garments decorated with over 3,000 ivory beads, each painstakingly drilled and stitched into place. Reconstructing his clothing requires more than a year of continuous labour. These weren't rags against the cold, they were masterpieces, fashion and function intertwined. The impact was revolutionary. Suddenly humans could push north of the 45th parallel into lands where Neanderthals had once dominated, but were now gone. They could hunt reindeer at the edge of the tundra, settle the mammoth steppe, and eventually cross into the Arctic itself. Clothing became a technology as critical as fire or stone tools. Without it, vast regions of Earth would have remained uninhabitable. The irony is striking. The future of our species may have hung not on spears or shelters, but on a hole no wider than a grain of rice carved into a piece of bone. The eyed needle turned fur into armour, hides into identity, and humans into Arctic conquerors. In a dim shelter on the frozen steppe, the firelight flickers across the form of a young man. He is dressed head to toe in garments that at first glance look purely practical: furs, stitch-tight boots laced snug, a hood pulled low, but look closer. Ivory beads catch the glow sewn in lines along seams. Tiny shells dangle from the fringe of his cloak, rattling softly when he moves. Each detail tells a story. Clothing in the Ice Age was more than insulation. It was technology, identity and artistry combined. Archaeologists piecing together burials like those at Sungir in Russia, or Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, are stunned by what they find. Garments weren't improvised scraps, but carefully constructed outfits layered and styled with intention. The bead patterns from Sungir alone suggest leggings. Tunics, cloaks, boots and hats, each with decorative trim. The investment of labour is staggering. One outfit might contain thousands of beads each, drilled and polished by a hand, each sewn into place with sinew. To dress this way was to spend thousands of collective hours of human effort. And yet these weren't luxuries wasted on elites. Children were dressed in the same care. A burial in Siberia revealed a child's parka made from the pelts of 30 ground squirrels, tiny pieces stitched into a complex mosaic to ensure maximum warmth without restricting movement. Even the youngest were wrapped in clothing that was both functional and symbolic. The furs themselves were chosen with the precision of an engineer. Reindeer provided the base for winter coats, their hollow hairs insulating like nature's fiberglass. Wolverine fur trimmed hoods resisting frost where wolf pelts would have iced solid. Otter and beaver skins were used for waterproofing, keeping hunters dry while crossing icy rivers. Each species was valued for its unique properties and nothing went to waste. Decoration too mattered. Shells from distant coasts appear in inland burials sewn into garments as tokens of connection. Teeth from foxes or deer were worn as pendants, perhaps signifying hunting prowess or kinship. Geometric patterns cut into fur trim, echo motifs later seen in cave art suggesting a shared symbolic language carried on the body itself. To wear these clothes was to declare who you were, where you came from, and what your people valued. And fashion was not static. Archaeological evidence shows regional variation in different cut styles, bead arrangements, and trim choices. One band might favour rows of ivory discs along a hem, while another stitched spiral patterns into cloaks. Clothing became a portable canvas broadcasting identity across a frozen world where meeting strangers could mean alliance or conflict. It's tempting to imagine Ice Age people as ragged survivors bundled in crude hides, but the truth is far richer. Their garments were designed layered like modern cold weather systems, engineered for efficiency and embellished with meaning. They were practical armour against the cold, but also symbols of belongings and status and artistry. When you picture them walking across the tundra, don't see shadows in rags. See figures cloaked in fur, trimmed with beads that glint in sunlight, boots stitched with precision cloaks patterned with shells and hoods rimmed in frost-free wolverine. They were in their way as much dressed for identity as for survival. And in that combination fashion and function lies the genius that carried humanity through the harshest chapter of the Ice Age. A farmer in Ukraine once drove his spade into the earth and struck something that felt like stone. But when the soil gave way, the curve revealed ivory. Not rock, but the jaw of a mammoth buried for 20 millennia. What archaeologists uncovered in places like Mezhairik and Mezin would astonish the world: entire houses built from the bones of mammoths. These weren't crude shelters thrown together in desperation. They were feats of engineering that demanded vision planning and community effort. At Mezhairik, 4 structures were excavated, each built from the remains of at least 149 mammoths. Skulls, each weighing over 100 pounds, were carefully interlocked to form foundations. Jawbones curved and strong were stacked as walls. Massive femurs arched upward like rafters. Tusks heated and bent into sweeping arcs, anchored roofs in place. Some houses measured over 16 feet across, requiring 20 tons of material, the equivalent of a modern building site. How were such houses possible in a world without wheels, pulleys, or draft animals? The answer is staggering. People carried, dragged, and placed each bone by hand. The logistics required cooperation on a scale few would imagine, teams working together to transport bones across frozen steppes, sort them by function, and assemble them with precision. One mistake could collapse tons of material. Yet these houses stood strong, insulated against the wind, their interiors warm enough that the difference from the outside could reach 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, archaeologists find evidence of carefully planned spaces. Sleeping areas lined with fox pelts, hearths for light and heat, storage pits dug into permafrost, turning the ground itself into natural refrigeration. At Mezin, a painted mammoth skull was found resonant when struck, suggesting a drum integrated into the architecture itself. Imagine sitting in a circle, the walls made of bones, the rhythm of a drum echoing from the very animal that sheltered you. But these weren't just homes. At some sites, structures contain no hearths or bedding. Instead, they show evidence of burning pigment and ceremonial use. Perhaps they were monuments, gathering places, or shrines, prehistoric cathedrals built from the bones of giants. Living inside such structures must have carried profound symbolic weight. To enter through the jaws of a mammoth, to sleep within its ribcage, was to declare mastery over the very creature that defined the Ice Age. Bone, unlike wood, had advantages. Dense and water-resistant, it insulated against cold better than timber. The hollow spaces in marrow cavities trapped air, acting like natural double-pane insulation. In regions where trees were scarce, mammoth bones were not just substitutes, they were superior building material. What's most striking is their endurance. Some mammoth bone houses show signs of rebuilding and reuse over centuries. They weren't temporary camps, but long-term dwellings with traditions of construction passed down like recipes. Imagine a lineage of builders teaching their children how to curve tusks, how to interlock skulls, how to lash scapula into stable walls. These were not just families, they were architects sustaining inherited blueprints for survival. To modernize, it might seem macabre, but to them it was genius. They took the remains of creatures that once loomed as threats and turned them into shelter, community, and identity. They did not simply hunt mammoths, they built their very world out of them. In the end, mammoth bone architecture was more than engineering. It was a declaration: we are not guests in the Ice Age, we are its masters. And long after the mammoths themselves vanished, their bones remained as silent monuments to the ingenuity of the people who refused to be defeated by the cold. On a windswept plateau in Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered a structure that puzzled them. Its walls were built of mammoth skulls, jaws, and tusks, but inside there were no hearths, no sleeping areas, no storage pits. This was not a home. It was something else, something larger, something meant for the community rather than the family. Many now believe these were ritual spaces, Ice Age cathedrals built not of stone but of bone. At the site of Kostenki, one massive ring of mammoth bones stretches nearly 40 feet across, assembled from at least 6 individuals. Imagine the effort required, years of collecting remains, coordinating dozens of people to drag, arrange and stack them into a monumental circle. And then when you step inside, silence, no evidence of cooking or sleeping, instead signs of burning pigment and perhaps ceremonies meant to bind people together. These weren't just shelters against the cold, they were statements carved into the frozen earth. We conquered the mammoth, we thrive in its shadow, we honour and master the forces that sustain and threaten us. To walk into one was to step into a sacred architecture, a space where survival met meaning. The symbolism runs deep. To live inside a mammoth bone house was already a gesture of dominance over nature. But to gather in a communal circle built of skulls and tusks was something more, a reminder that humans were part of a vast cycle, both predator and inheritor. Every bone had once moved with life. To build with them was to transform death into continuity. At Mezin, archaeologists found a mammoth skull painted with red ochre, its surface decorated with swirling geometric patterns. Was it a drum, a ritual object, a monument to the animal spirit? We may never know, but it tells us that these spaces were not purely functional. They were canvases for art, memory and belief. It is no accident that such structures rose during the most brutal cold of the last glacial maximum. When survival was at its hardest, people reached for meaning, for gathering places where fear could be transformed into ritual and ritual into resilience. In those circles of bone stories were told, alliances forged and songs sung. The walls themselves, curved tusks, stacked skulls, were not mute. They resonated with the identity of a people who made the frozen steppe their home. And think of what it meant to a child. To grow up walking through the jaws of a mammoth, to enter a gathering space, to sit under tusks bent into arcs like cathedral arches, to hear elders tell myths in the flicker of firelight reflecting off ivory walls. The architecture was not only shelter, it was education, imprinting awe and belonging into the next generation. Modern architects study these structures for insights into sustainability, but perhaps the Ice Age builders would smile at that. For them it was simpler and yet grander. These cathedrals of bone were declarations of survival, of community, and of imagination. They remind us that humans have always been more than toolmakers and hunters. We are meaning makers. Even in the harshest climates, with death stalking every horizon, we did not only build to live, we built to believe. Close your eyes and imagine the Arctic night, a darkness so complete it feels alive, the cold pressing into your bones until breath fogs into ice. In such a world, fire wasn't just warmth, it was survival. But wood was scarce on the mammoth steppe, and the dwarf willows or birches that dotted the tundra could not possibly supply the constant demand. So Ice Age people did something remarkable. They engineered fire. Archaeological sites like Kostenki Dolny Vestonice and Mezhirek reveal hearths more sophisticated than mere piles of ash. Some were broad communal fires for cooking and heat, others narrow and concentrated for tool-making, requiring precise control of temperature. Flint, for example, when heated to a certain threshold, became more workable. Stone transformed at the molecular level by careful placement in coals. To achieve this, Ice Age builders monitored their fires like chemists adjusting airflow with rocks, bones and pits. The fuel itself tells the story of ingenuity. Wood may have been scarce, but bones were not. When burned, mammoth and bison bones release intense, long-lasting heat. A Kostenki analysis of ash revealed high-temperature combustion, upwards of 650 degrees, achieved by preparing bones with fat and marrow. This wasn't a campfire tossed together. It was fuel science, the deliberate manipulation of material for maximum efficiency. Then came the fat lamp revolution. At Dolny Vestonis, archaeologists uncovered carved stone lamps, shallow basins filled with animal fat with twisted moss or fibre as wicks. These lamps burned cleanly for hours, producing steady light and heat with minimal smoke. Imagine sitting in a mammoth bone house, a soft golden flame illuminating beadwork carvings, or faces gathered in story. Fat lamps turned endless nights into human time for art, for memory, for love. Even dung became resource. At sites across the steppe, traces of herbivore droppings show they were dried and burned, providing a slow, smouldering fire. What we might recoil from, Ice Age people embraced as another tool in their arsenal. Survival left no room for waste. And then the most surprising discovery, ceramic heating elements. At Dolní Věstonice, fragments of fired clay reveal that Ice Age people experimented with ceramics not for pots but for warmth. Some pieces were shaped into spheres or slabs fired until hard, then used to store and radiate heat long after the flames had died. Archaeologists call this prehistoric thermal banking, the first stirrings of an idea that would lead millennia later to brick stoves and ovens. The arrangement of hearths also shows foresight. At the Cavemen site in Ukraine, 3 distinct hearths appear side by side, one large for communal use, one medium for crafting, and one small for delicate work like bead drilling or sinew preparation. Each burned differently, each served its role. This was not improvisation, it was specialization fire as a toolkit. But perhaps the greatest innovation was psychological. Fire wasn't just energy, it was community. Gathered around it, humans shared food, repaired clothing, sang songs, and taught children. The hearth was the first classroom, the first theatre, the first parliament. In the Ice Age, to lose fire was to risk death. To tend it was to protect the very thread of life. We often imagine early humans as merely discovering fire, stumbling upon sparks in the wild. The truth is far richer. They designed fire, managed it, optimized it. They invented fuel systems, lighting technologies, and thermal storage centuries before the word engineer existed. The fires they built were not primitive, they were masterpieces. And in their glow, humanity's greatest leap forward burned steadily against the cold. In the deep black of an Ice Age winter night, when the wind howled across the steppe and the stars shimmered like ice, the flicker of a single flame could mean the difference between life and death. But in that tiny light there was more than survival, there was warmth of the spirit. The Ice Age was not simply endured with fire, it was shaped by hidden flames crafted with extraordinary ingenuity. One of the most extraordinary tools was the fat lamp. Archaeologists at Dolní Věstonice and Mezin have uncovered shallow carved stones, their surfaces charred and greasy. These were lamps filled with animal fat, mammoth, reindeer, bison, topped with wicks made of moss grass or twisted fibre. When lit, they burned not in the brief flare of a stick torch, but steadily for hours. Imagine the golden glow bathing the interior of a mammoth bone house, illuminating beads as they were sewn ivory as it was carved, and faces gathered in storytelling. Smoke was minimal heat, steady and light portable. In a world of endless winter fat lamps turned night into human time. When wood was scarce, people turned to bones. Burned bones, especially those rich in marrow, produced flames hotter and longer than most fuels. Archaeological ash layers tell the tale of these bone fires engineered to extract every ounce of energy from the remains of hunted beasts. Nothing was wasted, muscle became food, hide became clothing, sinew became thread, and bones themselves warmed the nights. To feed a fire with bones was not grotesque but ingenious, a recycling system as practical as it was symbolic. Cooking too took on ingenious forms. At multiple sites across Eurasia, archaeologists find stones cracked from heat in peculiar patterns. The explanation: hot stone cooking. Stones were heated in a fire, then dropped into hide-lined pits filled with water. The sizzling stones brought the liquid to a rolling boil, cooking meat tubers and grains without smoke to betray their presence. It was efficient, discreet, and capable of feeding dozens from a single pit. These invisible kitchens made it possible to thrive even when fuel was precious and predators prowled the dark. But perhaps the most moving evidence comes from the miniature kits found in children's burials. Tiny strikers, small pieces of flint, even toy-sized fire-making sets were buried alongside them. To us they looked like trinkets, to them they were lessons, tools, hope for the future. Children were taught to kindle flame almost as soon as they could walk, for fire was not just a luxury, it was life. To gift a child a miniature fire kit was to entrust them with the power of survival, to prepare them for the responsibility of adulthood. And fire was never only practical, it was psychological technology. To sit by a hearth was to dissolve fear in the crackle of warmth, to bond in laughter, and song to carry stories through the long night. The fire was a stage for storytelling, a shield against loneliness, and the first true centre of human community. In its circle, knowledge was passed, grief was shared, alliances were made. The flames of the Ice Age were small, fragile, easily extinguished by a gust of wind, but they carried a weight beyond measure. Each lamp, each bonfire, each glowing pit of stones was not just heat. It was proof that humans could light the darkness, that they could make the frozen world bend to their will. And even today, when we gather around campfires, candles, or hearths, we are still tending those same flames, hidden, eternal, and profoundly human. When you imagine Ice Age hunters, Hollywood has likely given you the picture: a band of shaggy figures charging headlong at a mammoth spears, waving roaring as tusks crash down around them. It's a thrilling image, but it's almost certainly wrong. The truth revealed through archaeology and physics is both less dramatic and far more impressive. A woolly mammoth could weigh 10 tons as much as a modern bus. One kick could shatter bones. One tusk sweep could fling a hunter yards through the air. To attack such an animal head-on with handheld spears would have been suicide. Instead, Ice Age hunters relied on patience, planning and technology. Archaeological evidence from sites like Langer-Ferguson in South Dakota and Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic shows that mammoth hunts were engineered events. Hunters used terrain traps and tactics to even the odds. In some cases, they drove animals into bogs or soft ground, where their weight became a weakness. A stuck mammoth unable to move freely was vulnerable. In others, pits were dug, massive undertakings requiring communal labour, then camouflaged with branches and snow. A single misstep from a mammoth could mean broken legs, panic, and the opening for a safe kill. The weapons themselves were marvels of design. The Clovis point, famous in North America, was not just sharp. It was fluted with a groove along its base that allowed it to be hafted securely onto a spear shaft. This design also distributed impact force, preventing shattering on bone and helping the point penetrate deeply. Modern experiments show Clovis points could puncture mammoth ribs and pierce vital organs if delivered with enough speed. How was that speed achieved? Not by throwing spears with bare arms, but with the atlatl, a spear thrower that acted like an extension of the arm. This device turned the human body into a lever, hurling spears with double or even triple the velocity of a hand throw. The physics are stunning. With an atlatl, a hunter could deliver kinetic energy comparable to a modern bow. Against megafauna, this difference meant life or death. But even with such tools, a mammoth was never taken by a lone hero. It was a team effort. Some hunters distracted others, closed in, while more waited with additional weapons. Once the animal was brought down, often after hours of pursuit, it became the centre of communal activity. Butchering a single mammoth could take days. Bones at kill sites show systematic processing: marrow, cracked out fat, rendered hides cut with precision. Nothing went to waste. The myth of reckless mammoth charges does a disservice to their achievement. What really happened was slower, smarter and more human. Success lay not in raw courage, but in observation, planning and cooperation. Hunters studied migration routes, learned the weaknesses of terrain, refined their weapons for centuries and taught their children the physics of patience. And yet there was awe in the act. To stand near such a giant, to see it collapse through coordinated human effort, must have felt like touching the boundary between mortal and divine. It was not only a hunt, it was a ritual, a story retold by firelight, a proof of what community could achieve against impossible odds. So the next time you picture a mammoth hunt, erase the image of reckless charges. Replace it with quiet figures crouched in snow, waiting, with weapons honed by generations, listening for the crack of ice beneath giant feet. Picture the moment when planning overcame power, when tiny humans brought down Earth's titans, not with brute strength but with patience, physics and unity. If survival in the Ice Age demanded anything, it was accuracy. Food was muscle and bone that moved quickly, fought back, or fled across miles of tundra. Miss once and a week's worth of calories vanished into the horizon. That is why Ice Age hunters didn't just wield brute force. They mastered weapons of precision. The spear was humanity's first great extension of the arm. Early hunters carried heavy thrusting spears, hardened in fire, and tipped with sharpened bone or stone. These were effective at close range, but dangerous. You had to be within striking distance of prey that outweighed you tenfold. Over time, spears evolved. Flaked stone points replaced fire-hardened tips. Balance improved. Shafts were crafted from straightened spruce birch or even mammoth ivory. Then came a revolution, the atlatl, or spear thrower. A carved lever with a hook at one end, it transformed the human arm into a catapult. With it, hunters hurled darts far lighter than thrusting spears, but deadly at distances of 100 feet or more. The atlatl amplified velocity 2 to 3 times beyond a hand throw, delivering enough force to penetrate the ribs of mammoths or bisons. Archaeologists find not only stone points, but also carefully weighted atlatls carved with animals or geometric patterns, suggesting both practical and symbolic value. Yet innovation didn't stop there. In some regions, evidence points to the earliest bows and arrows likely appearing toward the very end of the Ice Age, around 15,000 to 12,000 years ago. Smaller projectiles tipped with microliths, tiny stone blades suggest lightweight rapid-fire weapons capable of felling deer, birds and fish. The bow introduced stealth speed and the ability to strike silently at range. It was the forerunner of hunting technologies that would dominate for millennia. Not every kill relied on sudden impact. Hunters also mastered the persistence hunter strategy still practiced by some traditional societies today. Here the weapon was not a spear but endurance. Humans uniquely suited for long-distance running pursued prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. On the open mammoth steppe, this meant tracking reindeer or horses for hours under the sun, guided by footprints, droppings, and subtle signs in the grass. Precision wasn't just in the weapon, it was in reading the land like a book. Camouflage was another subtle but critical weapon. Hunters stitched white furs for winter blending into snowfields where herds grazed. They smeared ochre or ash on their skin, masking their scent and breaking their outlines in shifting light. At kill sites, archaeologists uncover evidence of blind screens of brush or snow walls where hunters waited for animals to pass. Precision was not only in the throw, but in the unseen patience that preceded it. Projectiles themselves became highly specialized. Clovis points in North America were fluted to absorb shock and ensure penetration. In Europe, Solutrean laurel leaf points, slender symmetrical razor-edged, show a level of craftsmanship that borders on artistry. Bone and antler, barbed points, lightweight yet strong, were engineered for fishing holding, fast once embedded. Every point was tailored to its prey, each one reflecting generations of trial and error. Together, these innovations turned fragile humans into apex predators. Precision allowed them to stand at a safe distance from danger, to hunt more effectively, and to waste less. It turned the balance of survival away from raw size and towards skill, patience, and design. Picture it: a band of hunters lying silent on the steppe, their cloaks blending with frost, their darts balanced on atlatls. A signal, soft, brief, and in a blur, projectiles arc through the air, striking with deadly accuracy. The herd scatters, the prey falls, and the people endure another season. Weapons of precision weren't just tools, they were equalizers. They allowed small bands to thrive where otherwise they would have perished. They were proof that intelligence could outmatch brute strength, and that survival wasn't about size but about aim. When facing a beast, many times your size strength alone was never enough. A mammoth could crush a man beneath a single step, a bison could gore with lethal speed, a deer could vanish into the horizon. To bring such animals down, Ice Age hunters learned to fight not with muscle, but with mind. They became students of behavior, illusionists on the steppe, and masters of collective strategy. One of their most effective tools was mimicry. Hunters observed herds until they knew their rhythms, the way reindeer moved in lines, the calls of geese on migration, the cautious steps of horses when water was near. With practice, they learned to imitate these sounds. Simple bone flutes and whistles found in sites like Geissen-Klusterl in Germany may have doubled as hunting lures, echoing bird calls or animal cries. Even rattling sticks or hoof-like clappers could be used to calm prey into thinking the sound came from one of their own. Disguise was another ingenious tactic. Hunters cloaked themselves in hides not merely for warmth but for camouflage. A wolf pelt thrown across the back might let a hunter stalk closer to bison. A deerskin hood complete with antlers could transform a figure into a harmless member of the herd until the critical moment. In France's caves, paintings of half-human, half-animal figures suggest this wasn't just practical, it may have carried ritual weight, blending identity with prey to bring luck or focus to the hunt. Noise could be as useful as silence. By banging stones or shouting from one side, hunters could drive animals toward hidden companions waiting with weapons. This funneling strategy, using cliffs, rivers, or narrow valleys, turned the land itself into a trap. At kill sites like La Côte de Saint-Brelade on Jersey Island, evidence suggests mammoths were driven off cliffs, their bodies butchered at the base. Such hunts required coordination, planning, and absolute trust between hunters. Group strategy was at the heart of it all. A single spear, no matter how sharp, rarely killed a mammoth or bison outright. But a dozen thrown in unison, striking from different angles, could weaken and confuse. One group distracted from the front, another circled behind, while others waited at ambush points. This choreography turned fragile humans into predators more effective than lions. The kill was not the triumph of one, it was the triumph of many thinking as one. Children too were part of this psychology. They were taught to observe animals from a young age, how they grazed, how they startled, where they fled when threatened. Hunters needed not just warriors, but watchers, mimics, and runners. Knowledge of behavior was as precious as any tool, and it was passed on in stories, gestures, and playful practice long before the hunt itself. In this Ice Age, hunting was as much about empathy as violence. To kill an animal, hunters first had to think like it, to feel its hunger, to sense its fear, to predict its next move. Intelligence, not brute force, tipped the balance. Picture it a line of hunters crouched low, antler hoods casting strange silhouettes in twilight, whistles in hand, moving as silently as the herd they shadow. From a distance you would not see men at all, you would see animals among animals, until the moment the illusion shattered. With a cry, a spear's flight, and the thunder of prey breaking into chaos, the psychology of the hunt was humanity's greatest weapon. We did not outmuscle the Ice Age titans, we outthought them. And in doing so, we began to discover the unique strength of our species to imagine ourselves into another creature's skin, and to use that imagination to survive. To survive the Ice Age, humans needed more than strength and strategy, they needed tools. And not just crude flakes, but instruments shaped with such foresight and precision that archaeologists today call them prehistoric engineering. Stone, bone, and ivory became the raw materials of invention, and in the hands of skilled toolmakers, they were transformed into technologies that defined entire cultures. At the heart of this revolution was blade core technology. Instead of striking random flakes from a cobble, Ice Age artisans carefully prepared a stone core, shaping it like a prism. From this core they struck long thin blades, uniform strips that could then be retouched into knives, scrapers, burins, or projectile points. It was efficient. One core could produce dozens of standardized tools, each sharper than steel scalpels when freshly flaked. The shift from clumsy flakes to elegant blades was as profound as the leap from typewriters to computers, but the real brilliance lay in specialization. Across Europe, Siberia, and the Americas, toolkits expanded into a dizzying variety. End scrapers thinned hides into supple leather, burins chipped bone and ivory into needles or figurines, awls pierced holes for sewing, backed blades provided cutting edges protected on one side to prevent injury during use. These weren't improvisations, they were distinct tool types, each crafted for a task reflecting a mental map of work before the tool was even made. Then came pressure, flaking, a technique demanding finesse. Instead of smashing stone with a hammerstone, artisans pressed carefully with bone or antler tines, peeling away tiny flakes with surgical control. Pressure flaking allowed for thinner, sharper, and more complex points. Solitary and laurel leaf blades, for example, are so symmetrical and delicate that modern flint knappers sometimes fail to reproduce them. To hold one is to see not accident but artistry, hours of concentrated effort encoded into a single edge. Hafting was another breakthrough. A point by itself is fragile, but attached to a shaft with sinew and resin, it becomes a weapon of power. Archaeological finds reveal multi-tool hafting systems, stone blades slotted into wooden or ivory handles to create composite knives or small microliths embedded in rows to form serrated edges. These composite tools were the prehistoric equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, modular, versatile, and easily repaired. What's striking is not only the function but the foresight. Toolmakers selected stone types for specific qualities: obsidian for razor sharpness, chert for durability, quartzite for impact resistance. They understood fracture mechanics long before the term existed. Each strike, each press, each retouch was a calculation balancing risk and reward. One slip could ruin hours of preparation. Precision wasn't optional, it was survival. And the tools themselves carried stories. Distinctive styles, Clovis in North America, Solutrean in Europe, Levallois in the Middle East, were like cultural fingerprints marking the movements of people across continents. Archaeologists trace migrations not only through bones and DNA, but through the signature of a blade's edge, the telltale angle of a pressure flake. Imagine sitting by a fire watching a toolmaker at work. Chips of stone scatter like sparks as a shape emerges from the core, first rough then refined until a knife glints in firelight or a point rests ready to hunt. Children would sit silently memorizing every motion, for this was not just craft, it was survival passed down stroke by stroke. In the end, the Ice Age was not conquered with brute force alone. It was conquered with foresight, with geometry and stone, with the ability to see a blade hidden inside a rock. Toolmaking was the quiet genius of the age, the engineering of survival etched in flint and ivory. If you walked into an Ice Age campsite at dusk, the sound of toolmaking would fill the air like music, the sharp tink of stone striking stone, the scrape of flint against antler, the whisper of pressure flakes peeling from a core. These were the sounds of survival and of teaching. Toolmaking was never a solitary act. It was performed in workshops where families gathered, skills were shared, and culture itself was napped into stone. Archaeological sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, Mezhýrek in Ukraine, and Grotte du Placard in France reveal areas littered with thousands of flakes. These are the classrooms of prehistory places where artisans sat together to craft blades, scrapers, and points. Nearby animal bones show signs of butchery hearths, mark warmth, and ornaments tell of leisure. Toolmaking was woven into daily life, a communal rhythm that turned raw stone into the extensions of human will. What's fascinating is the emergence of regional styles, what archaeologists sometimes call dialects of stone. In France and Spain, the Solutrean laurel leaf blades gleam with delicate symmetry, their edges so thin they are almost translucent. In Central Europe, distinctive shouldered points dominate. In Siberia, robust wedge-shaped cores gave rise to blades tailored for Arctic prey. In North America, the unmistakable Clovis points, fluted, efficient, lethal, became cultural signatures. Each group spoke its own language of stone, instantly recognizable to those who knew the craft. Within these traditions, tools grew increasingly modular. Instead of carving a single large blade for one use, people made microliths, tiny stone blades often less than an inch long, that could be slotted into bone or wooden shafts. Placed side by side, they created serrated cutting edges, replaceable when one dulled or broke. A broken microlith was no disaster. It was swapped out like a part in a machine. These composite tools foreshadowed modern design thinking, efficiency, repairability, adaptability. The workshops also reveal another truth: children were present. Among the thousands of flakes, archaeologists often find clumsy strikes over thick blades or broken attempts, clear evidence of beginners practicing beside masters. A child might sit in a circle copying the motions of an elder, striking too hard, too shallow, but learning with each mistake. These apprentice marks are as moving as cave art proof that knowledge was not hoarded, but passed forward patiently, one flake at a time. And toolmaking was never just mechanical. It was accompanied by stories, songs, gestures, mnemonics to teach rhythm and technique. Hold the core this way, strike at this angle, press slowly, hear the sound of the flake. Knowledge was encoded, but in voice and movement, transmitted not in books but in bodies. The fact that styles remained consistent across centuries tells us how strong those traditions were, whole lineages of skill preserved with astonishing fidelity. Every campfire workshop was a forge of both tools and identity. To chip stone was to declare belonging to a culture, to a lineage of makers whose style was as recognizable as a dialect or a song. To master a point or scraper was to inherit not just a skill, but a worldview, patience, precision, respect for material. When we look at the scatter of flakes today, it may seem like debris, but in truth they are the footnotes of classrooms, the whispers of apprentices, the rhythm of a society shaping its survival with stone. Workshops and regional styles remind us that humanity's genius lay not in one invention, but in the act of teaching passing fragile knowledge forward so it could outlast the cold. In the scattered flakes of stone that litter ancient campsites, archaeologists see not just tools, but lessons. Among the perfect blades and symmetrical points, they find mistakes, cores, struck at the wrong angle, shards broken. From overpressure, clumsy flakes too thick to use. These aren't failures. They are practice pieces, the fingerprints of learning. They are the echoes of children sitting beside elders, imitating, fumbling, trying, again, until the rhythm of the craft entered their hands. The Ice Age was not kind to forgetfulness. A missed strike could ruin a tool. A dull edge could mean starvation. That is why the learning curve of toolmaking was steep but patient. Elders taught with gestures and demonstrations, their knowledge carried in muscle memory. Children began with simple scrapers, graduated to blades, and only later mastered the delicate art of pressure flaking. The archaeological record preserves these stages like the pages of a silent textbook. And yet the miracle is not just that individuals learned, but that entire cultures preserved styles and techniques for thousands of years. Solutrean laurel leaf points, Clovis fluted blades, Gravettian burins all retain their recognizable forms over centuries, even as generations passed. That continuity speaks of more than skill. It shows that knowledge was embedded in the fabric of society, carried in rituals, stories, and daily practice. Toolmaking was never only about utility. Each style carried identity. To shape a blade in the manner of your people was to declare who you were. It was as cultural as language, a dialect spoken in flint and obsidian. When groups migrated, they carried their tool traditions with them, leaving behind trails of style that archaeologists now use to trace human journeys across continents. Knowledge persisted because it was shared, not hoarded. Hunters taught children how to stalk prey, how to recognize tracks. Women and men alike learned to scrape hides, sew seams, shape awls. Every person carried part of the cultural toolkit, ensuring no single loss could erase survival skills. In this way, knowledge was more durable than bone or ivory. It could be replicated, endlessly renewed with each generation. Even in times of upheaval, the sudden cold of the younger dryas, the vanishing of mammoths, the floods of retreating ice, the knowledge endured. Children who practiced on broken flakes one day became masters, teaching new apprentices. The rhythm of stone against stone of sinew through bone needles of fire tended and fat lamps filled, never broke. It carried humanity through shocks that might have erased less adaptable creatures. What we see in these practice pieces is a profound truth. Culture is memory made durable, not written in books, but carved into habits, rituals, and skills that flow from one body to the next. In the persistence of knowledge lies the real victory of our species. When the glaciers finally melted and seas rose to drown the land bridges, when the mammoth steppe vanished into forests and tundra, the tools evolved but the teaching remained. The inheritance of survival was never in the tools themselves, but in the ability to learn them, share them, and pass them forward. The persistence of knowledge turned fragile humans into the most resilient species on Earth. It was our true fire, the one flame that never went out. When we picture the Ice Age, our minds leap to mammoths, towering beasts with sweeping tusks, the icons of prehistory. But the truth written in bones, hides, and threads is different. Humanity's most dependable ally was not the giant, but the steady, tireless reindeer. Reindeer were the heartbeat of the Ice Age economy. Unlike mammoths, whose migrations were vast and unpredictable, reindeer moved in predictable seasonal herds. Twice a year, rivers of animals flowed across the tundra, thousands strong, passing along the same valleys, through the same fords, across the same plains. Hunters learned these rhythms like clockwork, timing ambushes with precision. If you knew the paths of the herds, you knew you would eat. And what reindeer offered went far beyond meat. Their skins were perfect for clothing, lightweight, layered with hollow hairs that trapped warmth. Archaeologists and Arctic peoples alike agree a reindeer parka could outperform almost any other hide in insulation. Stitched into leggings, boots and hoods, reindeer furs formed the base of survival wardrobes. Without them, northern expansion would have been impossible. The sinew of reindeer was equally vital. Stripped from tendons and dried, it became thread stronger than modern nylon, used to sew hides into waterproof garments and tailored boots. The invention of the eyed needle was useless without strong thread, and reindeer provided it in abundance. Every stitch in Ice Age clothing carried the hidden gift of tendon transformed into fibre. Their antlers became raw material for tools, spear tips, harpoon heads, awls and ornaments. Unlike bone, antler is tough yet workable, capable of taking sharp edges and enduring stress. Archaeologists find antler points everywhere across Ice Age sites, proof of how essential they were to daily life. Even the bones had their purpose split for marrow, carved into handles or burned as fuel when wood was scarce. Fat provided light for lamps, meat-filled stew pots, hides stretched into shelters. Every part of the animal was used. To kill a reindeer was to secure clothing, tools, thread, light, and food in one stroke. This reliance shaped culture itself. Cave art at Lascaux and Altamira shows reindeer alongside mammoths and bison, but in far greater numbers. Engravings on bone carvings in antler, even children's toys depict the animal that sustained families year after year. While mammoths dominated the imagination, it was deer that dominated reality. Communities often measured time not in moons but in migrations, spring herds moving north, autumn herds returning south. Campsites clustered near river crossings or choke points where reindeer would funnel together. Entire social calendars bent to the rhythm of the herds. Weddings, rituals, and gatherings were timed with the abundance of meat and hides. To be human in the Ice Age was in many regions to be bound to the life of reindeer. The irony is striking. The great mammoth left massive bones and breathtaking tusks immortalized in burials and myths, yet it was the smaller, humbler reindeer that truly kept people alive. They were the Ice Age's domesticated dream before domestication, so reliable, so essential, that when domestication came millennia later, it was the reindeer that stepped most naturally into partnership with humans. Strip away the Hollywood mammoth hunt, and what you see is the quieter, steadier truth. The Ice Age was not won by daring feats against giants, but by patience, foresight, and dependence on the animal that always returned. The reindeer was the real foundation of Ice Age survival. Its hooves carried not only itself across the steppe, but also the families, cultures, and futures of those who followed it. If any single fact proves the centrality of reindeer to Ice Age survival, it is this: people hunted them in the same places for over 12,000 years. At sites like Cavemen on the banks of the Seine in France, archaeologists uncovered layer upon layer of reindeer bones, hearths, and stone tools stacked like pages in a book. Each layer was another season, another migration, another generation returning to the same river crossing to repeat what their ancestors had done. The story at Cavemen is astonishing in its continuity. Families camped there every autumn as the herds moved south. Hunters positioned themselves at the river's edge where reindeer were forced to ford the water. Their movements slowed and predictable. Spears and darts rained down the air, filled with chaos, and then the butchering began. The bones that litter the site show systematic processing. Meat stripped, marrow, cracked sinews, pulled hides carefully removed for clothing. Year after year, century after century, the same rhythm played out. Excavations paint a vivid picture of camp life. Hearths carefully maintained dot the site in neat arrangements. Stone tools lie scattered, where knappers sat retouching blades or making new points as the hunt continued. Ash deposits preserve traces of meals, perhaps stews of meat and bone marrow cooked in hide-lined pits with hot stones. Even children left their mark. Tiny flakes of stone from clumsy hands show they were learning the craft alongside adults, their first lessons unfolding at the edge of migration paths. And Cavemen was not unique. Across Europe and Siberia, reindeer hunting camps show similar patterns: seasonal gatherings, specialized processing, and knowledge passed forward. Sites at Stellmore in Germany and Luxury Bassé in France reveal reindeer bones in staggering numbers, sometimes hundreds in a single layer. These were not opportunistic kills, they were planned harvests, coordinated events that relied on detailed knowledge of herd behavior. What's most striking is the scale of specialization. At Stellmore, archaeologists found reindeer bones pierced with dozens of projectile points, evidence of mass kills. At Pinsvent, antlers were stacked separately, hides processed with scrapers, sinews dried for sewing. Hunters and craftspeople worked side by side, dividing labor efficiently. Each kill became not just food, but clothing, tools, and light for the coming winter. 12,000 years of continuity tells us something profound. Reindeer were reliable in a way no other resource was. Mammoths vanished, climate shifted, ice sheets melted, but reindeer kept coming back season after season. They were the metronome of the Ice Age, their migrations beating time for human societies. Imagine the anticipation. As summer waned, families packed up camps and moved toward familiar fords just as their ancestors had. Children listened for the distant thunder of hooves, learning to recognize the sound before they ever saw the herd. When the reindeer came, life surged back into abundance, meat roasting on fires, sinews stretched on drying racks, furs stitched into winter clothing. When the herds passed, camps emptied, leaving behind ash and bone waiting for the next year. The continuity of reindeer hunting reveals something about us too. It shows that Ice Age survival was not just chaos or improvisation. It was tradition, memory, and patient repetition. These camps were not accidents, they were anchors of culture, grounding families in landscapes that changed around them. At Pinsvent, the bones of reindeer tell us not just of kills but of resilience. They remind us that sometimes survival isn't about dramatic hunts or monumental feats. Sometimes it is about quiet reliability, about knowing that the herds will return, and about showing up generation after generation to meet them. When we picture Ice Age meals, we imagine sizzling mammoth steaks or reindeer roasts turning over a fire. But recent science has cracked open a surprising truth: humans of the Ice Age ate far more than meat. The evidence lies not in bones or hearths, but in something humbler: dental plaque. Plaque that hardened film on teeth is a time capsule. When archaeologists examined the teeth of Ice Age skeletons under microscopes, they discovered tiny starch grains, pollen, and plant fibers locked inside. What they found rewrote the menu of prehistory. Far from being pure carnivores, Ice Age people ate a rich variety of plants: roots, tubers, seeds, berries, nuts, even grasses. It was in effect an Ice Age salad. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, the teeth of Neanderthals revealed traces of wild barley, legumes, and even evidence of cooking. At El Cidrón in Spain, plaque preserved starches from pine nuts and moss. In upper Paleolithic burials in Europe, residues show humans chewed cattail roots, acorns, and wild grains. These weren't occasional snacks, they were staples. Plants provided what meat could not. Carbohydrates fueled the brain, which consumes a quarter of the body's energy even at rest. Fat and protein kept bodies alive, but starches provided quick, reliable energy for long hunts, cold nights, and bursts of creativity. Without plants, our ancestors could not have sustained the mental edge that made them such effective hunters, artists, and innovators. And plants offered more than calories. Berries supplied vitamin C, preventing scurvy in long winters. Nuts delivered fats and micronutrients. Roots and tubers gave fiber-aiding digestion. Even bitter herbs may have served medicinal purposes at El Cedron. Chemical traces suggest Neanderthals chewed yarrow and chamomile, both with anti-inflammatory properties. The Ice Age salad wasn't just fuel, it was medicine. Preparation mattered too. Grinding stones found at sites like Dolní Věstonice show that people processed wild grains into flour. Combined with hot stone cooking, or baked on flat rocks near hearths, this flour became primitive bread. Imagine a meal of roasted reindeer dried berries and a chewy flatbread of wildgrass seeds, a far cry from the meat-only diets once imagined. For children and elders, plants may have been especially important. Tender roots and berries provided easy-to-chew food when teeth were weak. Mothers could mash tubers into pastes for infants. Food diversity made communities resilient, cushioning them against the unpredictability of hunting. Archaeologists now talk about the broad-spectrum revolution, but in truth it began much earlier than once believed. Ice Age people were not just hunters of giants, they were foragers of landscapes, sampling everything that grew, learning which plants healed, which poisoned, which nourished. That knowledge passed through generations was as critical as any spear or scraper. So while the drama of the mammoth hunt dominates our imagination, the quiet act of digging up roots or plucking berries may have been just as vital. The Ice Age diet was not meat versus plants, it was both in balance. Picture it a family gathered around a hearth. Meat simmers in a hide-lined pit while children munch on berries gathered earlier. Someone chews a root, spits fibers into the fire. A flat cake of wild grain flour browns near the coals. This was not a diet of desperation, it was cuisine, Ice Age style. The next time you hear of the paleo diet, remember. The true Paleolithic plate was colourful, varied and creative. The Ice Age salad kept minds sharp, bodies strong and cultures thriving. The Ice Age hunter's toolkit wasn't complete without a hunter's mind. Yet alongside the spears and atlatls, there was another quieter mastery: plants. For thousands of years, humans studied roots, seeds, berries, and herbs with a precision that rivals modern pharmacology. This was not trial and error alone, it was observation, memory, and innovation passed from generation to generation. At sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, archaeologists uncovered grinding stones stained with plant residues. These weren't incidental scratches. They were evidence of systematic food processing. Grains of wild wheat and barley were crushed into flour mixed with water and baked on flat stones near the fire. The result was a primitive bread, dense, chewy, portable. For hunters on long treks, such carbohydrate-rich foods were as critical as meat. Cooking innovations went further. Heated stones were dropped into hide-lined pits filled with water to make stews of tubers, herbs, and meat. This technique, replicated experimentally, yields nutrient-rich broths, softens fibers, and extracts medicinal compounds from plants. Archaeological traces of cracked stones found in clusters confirm that this hot stone cooking was a widespread innovation. Imagine a family gathered around a steaming pit, not just eating, but sipping a warming soup that carried both calories and healing. The knowledge of plants extended into medicine. At Neanderthal sites like El Cedron in Spain, chemical residues on teeth revealed traces of yarrow and chamomile plants, bitter to the taste but known for anti-inflammatory and calming properties. In Shanida Cave, pollen deposits suggest intentional placement of medicinal flowers in burials. Whether for healing the living or guiding the dead, these plants carried meaning beyond the physical. Herbal mastery was not accidental. Over generations, people watched animals for clues. They saw reindeer paw at roots to ease hunger, or sick wolves chew bitter herbs and recover. They experimented, tested, remembered. A plant that soothed a wound or eased childbirth became part of collective memory. By the time a child was grown, they had likely learned which leaves stopped bleeding, which berries killed pain, which bark reduced fever. This was a living pharmacopoeia carried not in books but in the minds of elders. And sometimes knowledge turned to transformation. Archaeologists suspect that fermentation, the accidental creation of alcohol, may have roots as deep as the Ice Age. Honey left to sit or berries stored in tins could ferment into low-strength drinks. If so, humans were not only eating and healing, but experimenting with chemistry-altering plants into entirely new experiences. Plant mastery was also about storage. Seeds and nuts were roasted and cached in pits, grasses braided into ropes, reeds woven into mats. Flexibility was the genius of the age. Plants fed healed, clothed, bound, and warmed. If meat was power, plants were versatility. To think of Ice Age people as meat-eaters alone is to miss their brilliance. They were botanists without books, healers without laboratories, cooks without kitchens, grinding stones, stew pits, herbal poultices. These were the laboratories of the Ice Age. Picture a camp at midnight. Hunters return with reindeer meat, but alongside them gatherers arrive with roots, berries, and herbs. A stew simmers, bitter plants steep into healing teas, seeds are ground into cakes. A child sits nearby watching, absorbing knowledge that will one day keep their own children alive. The truth is clear, the people of the Ice Age didn't just live off the land. They read it, memorized it, and rewrote it into culture. Their mastery of plants was not lesser than their mastery of stone or bone. It was the hidden knowledge that kept them alive, body and spirit alike. When the ice tightened its grip on the land, when reindeer herds shifted and mammoths dwindled, our ancestors did something bold. They turned to the sea. For most of human history, the ocean had been a barrier, deep, mysterious, and dangerous. But during the harshest millennia of the Ice Age, it became a savior. Along rocky coasts and tidal flats, communities discovered a new world of abundance. Archaeological sites across the Mediterranean tell this story in shell and bone. At Cueva de Nerja in Spain, layers of discarded shellfish pile high, not random refuse but systematic harvesting. Spring-spawning fish dominate the remains, proof that these early seafarers understood not only how to catch fish, but when to expect their seasonal runs. To thrive on the shore meant knowing the tides, the breeding patterns, the hidden schedules of the sea. The tools they created are nothing short of revolutionary. From Spanish caves and Japanese islands alike, archaeologists have uncovered fish hooks carved from bone and antler, some barbed for grip, others polished smooth from use. These hooks were not crude improvisations, they were carefully designed, showing wear from lines pulled taut. Nets followed soon after. Stone sinkers worn smooth by cords suggest woven nets cast into shallows or rivers, enabling entire schools of fish to be harvested at once. One hook meant one fish, a net meant a feast. Then came harpoons and toggling points, ingenious devices that once lodged inside a fish or seal would twist and hold fast, impossible to shake free. With these Ice Age hunters became sealers, whalers, and ocean specialists. The Mediterranean sites show harpoons carved from red deer antler, elegant in their simplicity. Half a world away in Japan's Jomon culture, similar innovations appear: bone points, shell weights, and evidence of boats sturdy enough for open water. The diet shifted dramatically. Bones from coastal burials show marine proteins making up half or more of the diet. Omega-3 rich fish iodine, laden seaweed shellfish bursting with minerals, all of it fed growing brains and resilient bodies. Children grew healthier, adults lived longer. The ocean became a pharmacy as much as a pantry, and the people themselves changed. Isotope analysis of skeletons from these sites reveals communities that specialized not hunters who occasionally ate fish, but maritime peoples who lived by the tides. Along the Channel Islands of California, for instance, the earliest inhabitants arrived by boat as much as 13,000 years ago. They carried with them bonefish hooks and nets, evidence that seafaring was no accident but a deliberate way of life. Even art reflects the transformation. In the submerged Cosca cave near Marseille, paintings of seals, fish, and jellyfish dance across stone walls. These were not mere decorations, they were maps of memory guides for future hunters, testimonies to a new relationship with the sea. The ocean gave more than food, it gave resilience. When inland herds vanished, the sea remained. When cold winds stripped forests bare, the tides still rose, the fish still spawned. To lean on the sea was to bet on eternity itself. Picture them, a group on a windswept Mediterranean shore, bone hooks tucked into belts, nets drying on driftwood racks, a seal stretched across a fire while children crack open mussels with stones. The salt air, the roar of waves, the knowledge that here at the edge of the world life could not only continue but flourish. The Ice Age was not just conquered by fire, fur, and bone. It was conquered by the ocean's bounty, by people who dared to cast their eyes beyond the horizon and imagine that survival could come from water as well as land. If the shore was the first threshold, the open sea was the second, and by the late Ice Age humans had crossed it. The evidence lies not in myths but in bone shells and voyages so daring they would make even modern sailors pause. On the Japanese islands, archaeologists uncovered tuna bones dating back nearly 10,000 years. Tuna are not gentle fish that drift close to shore. They are powerful deep-water predators that demand boats sturdy enough to handle the swell and gear sophisticated enough to land them. This was not the work of accident. It was the work of seasoned seafarers. Imagine hunters, once masters of the steppe, now leaning out over wooden hulls, eyes scanning the glittering waves for flashes of silver muscle. The Channel Islands off California tell another part of the story. These islands have never been connected to the mainland, not even when sea levels dropped at the glacial maximum. Yet by 13,000 years ago, people lived there carrying with them bonefish hooks, nets, and baskets woven for shellfish. The only way to arrive was by boat. That means watercraft not only existed but were seaworthy enough to cross open channels repeatedly, ferrying families, tools, and traditions. These weren't accidental drifters, they were colonists of the sea. Dietary evidence deepens the tale. At Natsushima in Japan, coastal communities left behind layers of shell middens, mountains of discarded clam oyster and scallop shells. The bones of seabird seals and even deep-water fish appear alongside them. More than subsistence, this was specialization communities who knew when certain species spawned where currents carried shoals and how to time their forays with the moon and tide. And then there is seaweed. For years it was overlooked in the archaeological record, soft tissue too fragile to preserve. But traces of iodine and marine isotopes in skeletal remains suggest it was a staple. Edible kelps provided not only calories but critical micronutrients, iodine for thyroid function, minerals for bone strength, compounds that sharpened cognitive health. Long before sushi bars, humans were rolling up strips of kelp for survival. Technology followed necessity. Bone gorges, slender pins swallowed by fish appear in many coastal sites. Harpoons tipped with toggling points allowed seals to be secured in icy waters. Nets grew larger and more sophisticated, their stone weights found in standardized sizes, as if entire industries had arisen around maritime hunting. And woven basket traps still used by modern fishers in parts of the world likely had Ice Age equivalents. The sea also became a highway. Obsidian artifacts discovered on islands like Hokkaido were traced chemically to quarries hundreds of kilometers away. This meant boats not only carried food but also stone shell and stories. The sea was no longer a boundary. It was a superhighway of exchange. Close your eyes and picture it, a fleet of hide-covered boats rocking gently on the surf. Men wielding harpoons, women weaving nets, children plucking shellfish along tidal pools. The sun drops behind the horizon and still the community works, sustained not only by reindeer or mammoth, but by the eternal rhythm of the ocean. This was the moment when humanity became more than land-bound survivors. We became seafarers, maritime people whose courage and ingenuity carried them, crossed channels into the deep, and ultimately into every corner of the earth. For all the marvels of the Ice Age, the eyed needle, the atlatl, the mammoth bone houses, one invention surpasses them all. It cannot be held in the hand or buried in the earth, yet it carried our ancestors through winters colder than Antarctica and crises fiercer than any predator. That invention was the band. Ice Age humans lived not as isolated families but as groups of roughly 25 to 30 people, the sweet spot for survival. Too few, and you risk starvation when a hunt failed. Too many, and the environment could not support you. Within this number, everyone knew everyone. Faces were familiar bonds, personal trust essential. The rules of the band were simple but radical, sharing was survival. Archaeological maps of sites like Pinsevent in France show reindeer carcasses divided evenly across hearths, cut marks spread with uncanny fairness. No family hoarded the best meat. No child went without. A hunter might have a lucky week and another might return empty-handed, but in a band luck was pooled. One day you gave, the next you received. Mathematically, this system meant life or death. Alone, a hunter might succeed only for cent of the time. Shared across 25 hunters, the odds flipped 95% survival. Leadership was just as fluid. There were no kings, no chiefs, no permanent rulers. The best tracker led the hunt, the most skilled seamstress. Guided clothing production, the elder, with memory of valleys and rivers as directed migration. Authority was situational, not inherited. Modern hunter-gatherers echo this pattern where persuasion carries more weight than commands, and mocking arrogance is the surest way to bring down a would-be tyrant. The burials confirm this egalitarian spirit. At Sungir in Russia, the elder dressed in thousands of ivory beads rests not as a monarch set apart, but alongside children and young adults granted similar honours. Rich grave goods were not hoarded by a ruling class, they were spread across age and status, suggesting a worldview where worth came from being human, not from domination. Conflict too was managed without violence. Ethnographic parallels with the Jew Huansi of the Kalahari or the Inuit of the Arctic suggest that Ice Age bands used storytelling, teasing and social pressure to diffuse tension. If disputes grew too heated, the solution was elegant. The band splits each side, walking away until tempers cooled, reuniting when survival demanded it. Archaeological evidence of sites abandoned and reoccupied in cycles hints at this rhythm of conflict and reconciliation. But perhaps the most extraordinary revelation is how inclusive these bands were. At Shanidar Cave, a Neanderthal lived for years, despite crippling injuries, blind in one eye, missing an arm, limping heavily. His survival meant others carried him, fed him, protected him. At Kafse, in Israel, a child with severe developmental disabilities was buried with red ochre and antlers, the same honours as any other. These societies did not discard the weak. They folded them into the group, recognising that care itself was survival technology. Picture it a ring of fires glowing in a mammoth bone house. Meat roasting furs, drying children laughing, as elders tell stories of the herds. No walls, no palaces, no crowns, only bonds. The real superpower of humanity was not sharper spears or warmer coats, but the ability to weave dozens of lives into one resilient net. This was the first social technology, the band society, and it was so successful that for 95% of our existence humans lived this way. We are still wired for it, still built to thrive in groups where trust runs deep and every life matters. If stone tools were the hardware of survival, then emotions were the software. Long before the written word, long before cities or kings, humans thrived because they could laugh, weep, comfort and remember together. In the Ice Age, emotional intelligence was as vital as fire or fur. Picture a frozen night on the mammoth steppe. Outside winds scream across the plains, slicing like knives. Inside a bone-walled shelter, a grandmother tells a story, her voice rising and falling with the firelight. Children giggle at her jokes wide-eyed as she mimics animals with shadows on the wall. The laughter itself is survival, a glue that holds the group together when fear and hunger might otherwise unravel them. Archaeology gives us glimpses of this emotional fabric. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, the remains of a Neanderthal man tell a remarkable tale. He had lived decades despite crushing injuries, one arm amputated, partial blindness and a crippled leg. Alone he could not have hunted, carried water or defended himself. He lived because others fed him, protected him, and saw value in him beyond his utility. That is not brute survival. That is compassion as a survival strategy. Homo sapiens carried the same torch. In Kafse Cave, Israel, a child with severe developmental disabilities was buried with red ochre antlers and shells the same honours as the most able-bodied hunters. The message etched in ochre is timeless, every life mattered. Even those who could not contribute to the hunt contributed something deeper: presence, connection, belonging. Stories reinforced bonds. Modern hunter-gatherers still sing songs that encode navigation, hunting knowledge or taboos. In the Ice Age, these tales weren't idle entertainment, they were memory palaces disguised as myths. A story about a trickster animal could encode migration patterns, plant cycles, or lessons about cooperation. Wrapped in humour or drama, the knowledge became unforgettable. Songs and rituals amplified emotions further. When groups gathered at aggregation sites like Dolny Vestonic's feasts and ceremonies likely included drumming, chanting, dancing, all synchronized movements that flood the brain with endorphins and oxytocin. This chemistry of belonging is older than agriculture, older than kingship. It is the heartbeat of community. And laughter, yes, laughter was itself an evolutionary tool. Shared humour signalled trust, diffused conflict, and made bonds feel unbreakable. In a world where a careless fight could split a band, jokes and teasing kept egos in check and reminded everyone that survival was a shared endeavour. What emerges is clear. Ice Age humans were not cold, silent figures hunched over scraps of meat. They were vibrant, emotional beings who loved, mourned, celebrated and cared. Their intelligence was not just mechanical or analytical, but deeply emotional, and that more than any other point may explain why we endured when others did not. Close your eyes and imagine it again, a disabled hunter leaning on a friend's shoulder, a child laughing at a puppet of fur cast against the wall, a woman softly singing as she stitches clothing by firelight. These were the invisible threads that wove humanity together, the warmth of bonds in the coldest of worlds. In the brutal ledger of Ice Age survival, one might assume the elderly were a burden slow to travel, unable to hunt, consuming precious calories. Yet the archaeological and biological evidence points to the opposite. Far from being expendable elders, especially grandmothers, were the hidden keystones of human endurance. Scientists call it the grandmother hypothesis. Unlike most mammals, human females live decades beyond menopause. In chimpanzees, fertility's end is life's end. But in humans, grandmothers outlive their reproductive years sometimes by 30 or 40 winters. Why? Because their survival increased the survival of everyone else. Archaeology provides vivid clues. At Sungir in Russia, an elderly woman, her teeth worn down her joints, arthritic, was buried with red ochre and beads treated with the same reverence as the strongest hunters. She was not a cast-off. She was honoured, remembered. In Ohello 2, a lakeside settlement in Israel grinding stones carry the polish of thousands of hours of plant processing. Who kept this encyclopedic knowledge alive? Likely the elders who no longer hunted, but who remembered which roots to dig, which seeds to grind, which tubers to leach of poisons. Grandmothers were living libraries. They stored the memory of decades, which valleys still held water in drought years, which summers brought early berry crops, which signs foretold a harsh winter. In a world without writing, this long memory was survival itself. A young mother burdened with nursing could not roam far. A father might be gone on long hunts, but a grandmother could provision her grandchildren, leading them to safe plants, instructing them in what was safe to touch, chew, or burn. Modern studies of hunter-gatherers confirm this. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, children with living grandmothers have significantly higher survival rates. The old women dig tubers with patience, feed young ones when mothers are occupied, and pass down knowledge of hundreds of plant species. Without them, many children would not live past 5, but their influence went beyond food. Grandmothers were also social architects. They mediated conflicts, told stories that preserved group identity, and arranged marriages to knit bands together. They were matchmakers, counselors, memory keepers. At Shanida Cave, a Neanderthal buried with flowers may have been such a figure, a healer, whose herbal wisdom outlived her body. Cooperative child-rearing or parenting was another uniquely human strategy. Grandmothers often raised children who were not their own. Genetic studies at Sungir suggest elders cared for unrelated youngsters, weaving networks of obligation and care that transcended bloodlines. This widened survival chances for the group and reinforced bonds that kept bands cohesive through crisis. Picture an Ice Age camp. Hunters leave before dawn, the fire still smouldering. Mothers tend infants, busy with stitching or scraping hides. And there, kneeling in the snow, an old woman shows children how to dig beneath the frost for edible roots. Her hands tremble, her back aches, but her mind is sharp. In those hands lies not just food for today, but memory for tomorrow. We survived the Ice Age not because the young were strong, but because the old were wise. The furthest horizon of memory lived in their voices. Each wrinkle was a chapter, each story a manual, each lesson a bridge across the abyss of time. Grandmothers were our first libraries, and without them, humanity's story might have ended in the snow. The Ice Age was cold, harsh, and often merciless, but humans found warmth not only in fires and furs, they found it in each other. Beneath layers of survival strategy lies another story, quieter, but no less important: love across the ice. Archaeologists uncover it in bead shells and ornaments scattered far from their origins. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, pierced shells appear that could only have come from the distant Mediterranean hundreds of kilometers away. Identical beads surface at sites separated by vast stretches of frozen steppe. These were not random trinkets. They were gifts exchanged between groups, tokens of connection and courtship. Marriage networks spanned enormous distances, stitching together the scattered bands of Europe and Asia. Strontium isotope analysis of teeth from Sungir in Russia tells us that young adults were not buried where they were born. Their chemical signatures show they traveled sometimes 200 kilometers or more to join new communities. They carried with them ornaments, beads, and the memory of their families. They were living bridges weaving bloodlines across the tundra. Why such effort? Because survival demanded it. A band of 30 people offered too narrow a pool of mates. Without outside partners, inbreeding could unravel genetic health within a few generations. Love, whether arranged or chosen, was not a luxury. It was a technology as vital as fire or the needle. And ornaments were more than decoration. They were identity markers, Ice Age passports. A pendant made from fox teeth might signal belonging to a certain valley. Amber beads spoke of Baltic connections. Seashells whispered of southern coasts. To wear them was to say, "This is who I am, this is where I come from." For potential partners, such symbols carried weight. They told stories of origin, kinship, and alliances. Imagine the scene an aggregation site where hundreds gather for a seasonal festival. Fires blaze, reindeer herds move across the plains, and young men and women meet strangers for the first time. Beads change hands. A fox-tooth pendant is given, a shell necklace received. Songs are sung, alliances made, and two people set out across the ice together, carrying not just genes, but connections that bind groups into a continent-wide web. This was love in the Ice Age, practical, strategic, but no less tender. The ornaments whisper of affection, pride, and longing. The migrations recorded in bones tell of courage to leave home for a future with another. Even across frozen steppes and glacial barriers, the human heart reached outward. Survival may have begun with food and shelter, but it endured because of something softer, the drive to connect, a pair, to promise. Love adorned in beads and carried in footsteps across the ice was as much a part of humanity's triumph as any tool of stone or bone. For most of the year, Ice Age life was intimate, local, bound to a circle of a few dozen faces. But then came the seasons of convergence, when scattered bands turned paths toward the same river, crossing the same steppe edge, the same hunting grounds. Archaeologists call them aggregation sites. For those who lived them, they were festivals, gatherings where survival was renewed not only in food, but in friendship, ritual, and love. Pinsevent in France tells the story. Their thousands of reindeer bones mark repeated hunts over 12,000 years. Not the quiet work of a single family, but the orchestrated labor of hundreds. Hunters drove herds into bottlenecks coordinated by signals, shouts, and experience honed over generations. The kills were massive, the butchery efficient. Archaeological maps reveal carcasses divided evenly among hearths, proof that sharing scaled up to the size of communities far larger than daily bands. But the hunts were only the beginning. Alongside butchered bone lay ornaments, beads, and tools from distant lands, evidence of exchange. Amber from the Baltic shells, from the Mediterranean flint, from far-off quarries. These were not simple trades of goods, but gestures of trust, affirmations of alliances. A bead passed hand to hand was both gift and promise. We are connected. The gatherings carried ritual weight as well. At Dolní Věstonice, Venus figurines and fired clay sculptures suggest ceremonial acts performed before many eyes. Painted bones, engraved tusks, and drums made from mammoth skulls may have accompanied dances that echoed across the frozen valleys. For a few short weeks, the lonely expanse of Ice Age Europe came alive with sound, colour, and movement. And there was matchmaking. The genetic and isotopic evidence leaves little doubt. Young men and women left their home groups at these gatherings, joining distant bands through marriage. Imagine the firelit nights, laughter drifting between camps, music pulsing from bone flutes, beads and pendants exchanged as tokens of courtship. For a species facing the genetic peril of isolation, these festivals were lifelines. Children played with others their age, learning games that transcended clan boundaries. Elders told stories to larger audiences, embedding cultural memory across groups. Knowledge about plants' migration routes, weather signs was passed not only within bands, but across them. These festivals were universities of the Ice Age, teaching trading and binding human networks across continents. Close your eyes and picture the scene: the smell of roasting reindeer meat in the air, the sound of flutes and laughter mingling with the low thunder of herds in the distance, a young woman fingering a necklace of beads gifted by someone from far away, elders nodding approval at new alliances. It is not difficult to imagine joy, even celebration, bursting through the bleakness of ice and snow. These aggregation festivals were more than survival, they were renewal. They gave people a reason to endure the lonely months, a reminder that they were part of something larger than their small band, part of a human web stretched across frozen continents. And perhaps most importantly, they made survival beautiful. Between the glaciers of North America and the steppes of Siberia stretched a vanished world, a land that no longer exists above the waves. We call it Beringia. Not a narrow isthmus, but a vast subcontinent twice the size of Texas, rich in grasses, willows, and game. For thousands of years, people didn't merely cross it, they lived there waiting. Genetic studies reveal a striking truth. Native American ancestry carries a bottleneck signature, a long pause when populations were isolated in Beringia for millennia before moving south. It was not a brief crossing, but a long stay, a waiting room of the Americas. Between about 25,000 and 15,000 years ago, while ice sheets locked the continent shut, humans settled on this steppe, building lives on what was then solid ground but is now submerged beneath the Bering and Chukchi seas. What was it like? Picture endless dust plains under a low Arctic sun, herds of mammoth and bison grazing on dry snow-swept grasses. Rivers wound sluggishly across permafrost, feeding lakes alive with waterfowl. The climate was cold but paradoxically drier and less icy than the glacial walls to the south. Wood was scarce, but bone and fat provided fuel. Food was plentiful enough that people did not merely survive, they thrived. Archaeological finds at Bluefish Caves in Yukon and sites across Alaska and Siberia suggest repeated occupation stone tools, butchered animal bones, traces of hearths. Recent studies of genetic markers show lineages that diverged in isolation here, proof of long-term settlement. These were not wanderers trapped by chance, they were communities adapting deliberately to a frozen frontier. Patience was their most powerful tool. For perhaps 10,000 years, families told stories beside bone-fueled fires, buried their dead in permafrost earth, and watched the horizon of ice. Elders spoke of the lands beyond, of forest to the south, of herds that might yet be followed when the glaciers pulled back. Generations were born, lived and died in Beringia, without ever seeing the Americas, but they carried within them the promise of a crossing. When the ice finally retreated, they were ready. Coastal routes opened river valleys, cut passages between receding glaciers, and the Beringian descendants poured southward. Within just a few thousand years, humans spread from Alaska to the tip of South America, one of the fastest colonizations in human history. But that speed was not the product of rashness. It was the reward of thousands of years of waiting, honing skills, and enduring together in the frozen cradle of Beringia. Imagine standing on a windswept Beringian ridge 20,000 years ago, staring south at the impassable wall of ice. You know you may never see it melt, yet you also know your children's children might. And so you wait. You adapt. You tell stories of the journey to come. In patience as much as in movement you survive. Beringia is gone now, drowned beneath 300 feet of ocean. But in every indigenous American genome, in every story of the first migrations, there lingers the echo of that long vigil, the patience of a people who held the world's edge until the ice let them pass. When we imagine Ice Age people, we see them as isolated small family bands huddled against the cold. But archaeology tells a different story. Networks, stretched thousands of kilometers, binding distant groups together, long before wheels, coins, or written contracts. The proof gleams black and sharp obsidian. Obsidian volcanic glass is a miracle material. It fractures into edges sharper than steel, perfect for knives, scrapers, and projectile points. But its sources are rare. Each volcanic deposit carries a unique chemical fingerprint, allowing modern scientists to trace a single flake to its mountain of origin. And the results are astonishing. Tools found thousands of kilometers from any volcano have been matched to quarries in Kamchatka, Japan, and even interior Alaska. Obsidian traveled over 2,000 kilometers. This wasn't random wandering. It was systematic movement. Stone passed hand to hand across the tundra, connecting groups who might never meet face to face. These exchanges were not just practical, they were diplomatic. To give obsidian was to give trust, to signal alliance, to weave bonds across immense distances. How was it carried? Likely by the dog sled trade networks. Archaeological evidence from Siberia and Alaska shows dog domestication reaching back more than 15,000 years. Sled runners made of bone paw prints near campsites and isotopic data from dog remains all suggest that canines were more than companions. They were engines of transport. A sled pulled by dogs could carry heavy loads of stone hides or food across snowy expanses faster than human porters. Imagine traders gliding across frozen rivers, obsidian blades tucked safely in packs, dogs panting in harness as the Arctic steppe opened before them. These were the superhighways of the Ice Age. Snow and ice, far from barriers, became roads. Rivers froze into straight white paths linking one band to another. Winter, with its cold and silence, was not a time of isolation but of movement, when sleds slid farthest and alliances were renewed. and what obsidian enabled went beyond tools. It sparked the earliest form of globalization. A family in eastern Beringia might cut meat with a blade chipped from a volcanic glass born in Kamchatka 2,000 kilometers away. A hunter on the Japanese coast might carry a point made from stone quarried in Hokkaido's interior. Each shard carried not only utility but story proof that humans were part of a continental network of exchange. Even ornaments travelled. Beads of obsidian drilled for necklaces show that prestige mattered as much as practicality. To wear a gleaming black pendant was to declare connection, to signal I belong to a world larger than this camp. Picture the scene: a band of traders arrives at a winter gathering, dogs shaking snow from their coat sleds laden with glossy black stone. Around the fire they unpack blades that shine like ice in the firelight. Gasps ripple through the crowd, each piece a miracle of sharpness and beauty. Soon the obsidian spreads outward again, carried to new camps, new bands, new horizons. The Ice Age was not only survival, it was connection. Across thousands of kilometers of snow and silence, humans built highways of trust carried by dogs lit by fire and remembered in stone. When the Ice Age pressed its cold hand hardest against the world, survival didn't spread evenly across continents. Instead, it clung to scattered strongholds, refugia pockets of warmth and resources where people, animals, and plants endured, while the rest of Europe lay buried in ice. Geography dictated who lived and who perished. In Western Europe, the Iberian Peninsula became one such sanctuary, sheltered from the worst glacial winds by mountains with milder winters and rivers that rarely froze. Iberia preserved species that vanished elsewhere. Oak and pine forests persisted there when tundra swallowed much of the continent. People too found safety crowding into caves and valleys where life could continue. Italy and the Balkans served the same role. DNA evidence confirms it. Modern Europeans carry genetic signatures traceable to these southern refugees. During the harshest glacial maximum, populations shrank to isolated clusters, genetic bottlenecks visible in the record. When the ice retreated, these clusters expanded again, recolonizing Europe. The people who painted, hunted, and sang in Iberian and Italian caves were not just survivors. They were the ancestors of millions. What did survival look like inside a refugium? It looked like art. In Iberia's caves, Altamira, El Castillo, Chauvet, just beyond the Pyrenees, paintings of bison, horses, and mammoths flourished, even as ice smothered the north. The harsher the outside world became, the more vibrant the inner sanctuaries of stone glowed with colour and imagination. Cave art wasn't a luxury, it was a survival strategy. Painting animals, replaying hunts, and filling chambers with sound and colour turned cold caverns into communal hearths of meaning. Archaeologists call this phenomenon a cultural refugium. While mammoths vanished from some regions, they lived on in ochre outlines on cave walls. While bands shrank to a few dozen, their shared identity was reinforced through ritual and imagery. To step into a cave was to step into continuity, to remind each other that even in bottleneck times, humanity's story was not over. Refugia also sheltered knowledge. Grandmothers carried memories of plants hunting trails and animal migrations that could resume when the ice released its grip. Families preserved tool styles unique to their valleys, bead patterns distinct to their clans. These cultural lineages, like the genetic ones, survived in small hollows of warmth, waiting to spread again when conditions allowed. Picture Iberia 20,000 years ago outside a frozen steppe swept by icy winds, inside a cave where bison gallop in ochre across the walls. Children watch by firelight as elders sing to painted horses, their voices echoing in chambers. The cave is not escape, it is defiance, a refusal to let memory and meaning freeze with the world. When the glaciers pulled back, it was from these refuges that people emerged, carrying forward both their genes and their stories. The Iberian and Balkan survivors were the seeds from which New Europe grew. The art, the songs, the bloodlines, all of it was preserved in those hidden sanctuaries. Refugia remind us that survival isn't always about conquest. Sometimes it's about retreat, patience, and the courage to keep culture alive when the world narrows. In the Ice Age, caves became cathedrals, valleys became lifeboats, and art itself became a lifeline across the storm. Just when the world seemed ready to thaw, the Ice Age reminded humanity of its fragility. About 1200 years ago, the great glaciers had begun their retreat. Rivers roared with meltwater and forests spread northward. Then, in a geological heartbeat, it all reversed. Temperatures plunged, ice surged back, and the earth froze once more. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas. For the people who lived it, it must have felt like betrayal. The evidence comes from cores of lake mud and ice. Pollen records show forests suddenly shrinking back to tundra. Tiny isotopes record temperatures dropping by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in a few decades. Archaeologists see it in the abrupt collapse of cultures like the Clovis in North America. Their distinctive fluted spear points vanish from the record just as megafauna mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths decline and disappear. What caused it? Theories abound. Some point to a catastrophic outburst flood as Lake Agassiz spilled trillions of gallons of meltwater into the Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents and plunging the northern hemisphere into cold. Others argue for a cosmic trigger, an asteroid or comet striking ice sheets, lofting dust and dimming the sun. The debate rages, but the effect is undeniable. A sudden global climate crash within a single human lifetime. For people, it was apocalypse. Communities that had begun experimenting with sedentary life gathering, wild grains, returning seasonally to fertile valleys faced devastation. In the Near East at Abu Huraira, evidence shows wild wheat abruptly pushed to its limits. Starvation drove innovation. People began deliberately planting seeds, tending stands, and for the first time, shifting from foraging to farming. Agriculture was born in desperation, a child of the Younger Dryas. Elsewhere, survival meant migration. Bands abandoned familiar valleys to chase new niches. In North America, Clovis hunters disappeared, replaced by fulsome groups who mastered bison hunting on the plains and by coastal peoples who turned to fish and shellfish. In Europe, groups retreated to refugia once more, clustering in southern havens until the cold relented. The great reshuffling of humanity had begun. The Younger Dryas was cruel, but it was also catalytic. In its chaos, old ways collapsed and new ones took root. Farming, herding, permanent villages all traced their spark to this sudden freeze. Humanity's relationship with the land was forever altered. No longer mere passengers of climate, we became architects of ecosystems, reshaping plants and animals to our needs. Imagine the whiplash a child born into greening valleys with abundant game grows old in a world of drought, famine, and bitter cold. To survive, her grandchildren sow seeds, pen goats, and guard granaries. In 1 or 2 lifetimes, humanity crossed a threshold forced open by catastrophe. The Younger Dryas reminds us that history does not march forward smoothly. It lurches, stumbles, and sometimes falls off a cliff, but it also shows the resilience of our species. Faced with the return of an ice age, people did not vanish. They adapted, invented, and set in motion the greatest transformation in human history, the rise of agriculture, and with it, civilization itself. By the end of the Ice Age, the world grew quieter. Where mammoths once thundered, only bones remained. Where giant sloths lumbered silence-filled forests. Saber-toothed cats, cave lions, woolly rhinos all vanished. Roughly 2/3 of the world's large mammals disappeared between 50,000 and 10,000 years ago. The question has haunted science ever since what or who killed the giants. One camp points to climate. As the Ice Age ended, ecosystems unraveled. Grasslands shrank as forests spread, depriving mammoths and horses of the endless steppes they needed. Warming dried lakes and altered migration routes. Large animals with slow reproduction and high caloric needs could not adapt quickly enough. Climate had toppled giants before the end of earlier glaciations, saw species vanish as environments shifted. Perhaps this was only the latest chapter, but another camp turns the finger toward humans. Archaeological sites across the globe show startling coincidences. Megafauna vanish shortly after people arrive. In Australia, giant marsupials disappeared within a few thousand years of human settlement long before the last glacial maximum. In the Americas, mammoths, mastodons and saber-tooths collapsed just after Clovis hunters spread. On islands from Madagascar to New Zealand, giant birds and tortoises lingered until people appeared, then fell within centuries. It may not have been one cause, but both. Climate weakened populations. Humans finished the job, a process some scientists call assisted extinction. Overhunting alone might not have erased mammoths from Eurasia, but when combined with shrinking steppes and disrupted food webs, it pushed them over the edge. Likewise, climate stress may have doomed saber-toothed cats, but human competition for prey accelerated their fall. The debate grows sharper when we look at details. Kill sites in North America show mammoth and mastodon bones pierced with Clovis points, direct evidence of human hunting. Yet these sites are rare. Were they the norm or just snapshots of unusual hunts? Climate models, meanwhile, suggest vegetation shifts too gradual to explain sudden die-offs. Was there a tipping point where both forces converged? Some species lingered, reminding us the story wasn't simple. On Wrangel Island, dwarf mammoths survived until just 4,000 years ago, contemporaries of Egypt's pyramids. In South America, giant ground sloths lasted well into the Holocene. In pockets where human pressure was low, giants endured. Where people pressed hardest, they vanished. The extinctions reshaped humanity as much as nature. With the loss of mammoths, societies turned more to reindeer, bison, and fish. With ground sloths gone, South American groups leaned harder on plants and domesticates. The disappearance of giants narrowed options but also spurred innovation. In some ways, civilization rose on the graves of the megafauna. Picture at a last mammoth trudging across Wrangel Island's tundra, unaware that its kind is nearly gone. A group of hunters watches from a distance, their spears tipped with flint. In the background, forests creep north, grasses recede, and the Ice Age closes its grip for the final time. Whether by spear, by climate, or by both, the giants left, and with them went a world richer, wilder, and stranger. Their absence reminds us of our power. Even before cities and steel, we were already shaping the fates of species, already reshaping the earth. The line between witness and cause is blurred, but the result is clear. Humanity entered the Holocene alone, carrying memories of the giants we helped to lose. When you stand inside the painted chambers of Chauvet-Lascaux or Altamira, it's easy to see them as galleries, prehistoric museums of beauty. But for the people who lit torches in those caves, the art was not decoration, it was instruction. In a world without writing, walls became manuals, memory palaces, and even something like augmented reality. Look closely and you see seasonal cues. At Lascaux, depictions of horses and bison align with migration cycles. Some animals appear in clusters or in postures, tied to specific seasons, pregnant mares in spring, fattened bison in autumn. To a child, learning when to hunt the painted wall was both story and schedule. Other images served as predator warnings. Lions prowl across Chauvet's walls, drawn with tense shoulders and narrowed eyes, teaching not only how they looked, but how they moved. At times, predators faced prey in sequences, as though rehearsing encounters. These were not idle doodles, they were lessons in vigilance, memory aids for the dangers outside. The caves themselves became part of the teaching. Artists used the bulges, cracks, and shadows of limestone as natural contours, giving animals three-dimensional life. A horse drawn on a swelling rock seems to leap forward when torchlight flickers. A mammoth carved into a wall's curve emerges as you shift your gaze. It was a kind of AR, the landscape itself overlaid with meaning. Sound added another layer. At Lascaux and other sites, researchers found that the most heavily painted chambers often have extraordinary acoustics. Clap your hands and the echo resonates like a drum, chant and the walls vibrate. Imagine hunters painting while flutes played, while drums echoed their rhythms. The cave was not silent, it was alive with soundscapes embedding memory in vibration as much as in image. Even the placement of art carried weight. Some images sit at cave entrances, easy for children and newcomers to see. Others hide deep inside, accessible only by torchlight and crawling, perhaps reserved for initiation ritual or advanced knowledge. To walk deeper was to progress through layers of meaning, like chapters in a book. What's most striking is the consistency across continents. In Europe, Africa and Australia, Ice Age peoples used caves as canvases, and their art shows the same principles: animals painted with exaggerated features, rhythmic sequences, and attention to movement. This was not random, it was pedagogy, it was survival encoded in pigment. Picture it, a group of children led into the flickering dark torches hissing. On the walls, red bison stampede as the rock seems to move. An elder points to swelling bellies on painted horses, explaining that they signal spring. A flute plays, echoing the sound of hooves. For those children, the cave is not art. It is a classroom, a survival manual written in stone and song. In this way, Ice Age people turned their most hostile environments into libraries of knowledge. Every line, every echo, every painted wall was a reminder, so this is when to hunt, this is what to fear, this is who you are. Art was not a luxury of survival, it was survival itself. When archaeologists uncovered the delicate fragments of a bird bone in a German cave pierced with carefully spaced holes, they realized they were holding more than an artifact. They were holding a flute, and with it evidence that Ice Age humans had mastered not only survival, but song. Music may seem like a luxury, but in the Ice Age it was a technology. Bone flutes, mammoth ivory pipes, and percussion instruments carved from skulls and antlers were not entertainment in the modern sense. They were tools of memory, of communication, of cohesion. The flutes, some more than 40,000 years old, play recognizable scales. Recreated, they produce tones hauntingly similar to those of modern instruments. Imagine the sound echoing in the chamber of Holfell's cave, vibrating against limestone walls, carrying melody into the dark. Such sounds were not random, they were patterned, structured. They were proto-language, rhythm and pitch, woven into shared meaning long before writing. Drums, too, carried power. Archaeologists suspect that hollow mammoth skulls or stretched hides may have been used for percussion. Even striking stalactites in caves creates deep bell-like tones. Rhythms bound groups together in hunts, rituals and storytelling. A steady beat made many bodies move as one, whether driving reindeer into traps or dancing around firelight. Music was also a memory system. Words alone fade, but song fixes knowledge in rhythm. Just as today we remember alphabets through rhymes. Ice Age peoples could encode hunting routes, plant lore or myths into chant and melody. A child might learn migration cycles not by lecture, but by song. To forget the words was to lose knowledge. To sing them was to preserve it. And then there was the social glue. Laughter strengthens bonds, but music fuses them. Playing flutes in harmony, chanting together, dancing in unison, all of these release neurochemicals that create trust and belonging. In a world where survival depended on cooperation, music was the invisible web that held bands together. Even Neanderthals may have shared this gift. At sites in Slovenia, a perforated cave bear femur has been interpreted by some as a flute. The debate continues, but the possibility suggests that music was not the privilege of Homo sapiens alone. It may have been the common inheritance of humanity. Picture it, a cold night in an Ice Age valley. Hunters return with reindeer meat fires blaze, and as food cooks, someone lifts a flute of bird bone to their lips. Notes float into the night soft and high, joined by a steady beat on a hollow log, then by voices rising in chant. Children clap, elders sway, and suddenly 30 people feel like one. The sound becomes warmth. The rhythm becomes memory. The song becomes survival. Music was not an accessory of Ice Age life. It was a technology of the spirit as essential as stone blades or tailored hides. With it, we did more than survive. We remembered, we united, and we dreamed. When archaeologists piece together skeletons from the late Ice Age, they see more than bones. They see a record of daily life etched into stature, teeth and joints. And what emerges is striking. The bodies of Ice Age hunter-gatherers were in many ways healthier than those of their farming descendants. The first difference is height. Ice Age hunters were on average taller and more robust than early agriculturalists. Men often stood near 5'9", 175 centimeters, or taller women close behind at 5'5", 165 centimeters. Compare this to the early farmers of the Fertile Crescent or Neolithic Europe, whose average height shrank by several inches. Farming narrowed diets to cereals, while hunting and foraging offered a broader protein-rich menu of meat, fish, nuts, fruits and wild grains. Their teeth tell another story. Dental plaque shows Ice Age diets included starches and plants, but cavities were rare. Sugars were scarce, and tough, fibrous foods cleaned teeth as they were chewed. By contrast, the dawn of agriculture brought widespread tooth decay as diets centered on soft carbohydrate-heavy staples like wheat, barley and maize. The dental record is stark. Hunter-gatherers smiled with healthier mouths. Their bones show high activity levels. Joints and muscle attachments were thickened from constant movement tracking, game hauling, wood carrying children, and roaming dozens of kilometers in seasonal rounds. Fractures were common, yes, but so were signs of healing, proof of both resilience and care. Compared to the spines of early farmers, often bent and compressed from repetitive field labor, Ice Age skeletons tell of lives demanding, but varied, a full-body workout written into daily survival. Perhaps most telling is social health. Burials like Shanidar's disabled Neanderthal or Sungir's honored elders show communities that cared for the vulnerable. High survival rates of injured individuals mean groups invested in one another, ensuring no one was left behind. Strong social bonds, reinforced by sharing ritual and music, buffered individuals against hardship. Modern hunter-gatherer studies confirm the same in small cooperative bands. Loneliness is rare, and stress is distributed across the group. But this is not to romanticize Ice Age life. Death came early. Infant mortality was high, accidents, frequent infections often fatal. Average lifespans rarely exceeded the mid-30s, though individuals who survived childhood sometimes lived into their 60s. Yet within those years, bodies were often lean, strong, and capable, shaped by movement, nourished by diverse diets, supported by communal care. Contrast this with post-agriculture populations, shorter stature, more cavities, weaker bones, higher disease loads from crowded villages, and close proximity to livestock. Farming fed more mouths, yes, but it also chained bodies to narrower diets and harder repetitive labour. Imagine an Ice Age band on the move. They stride across an open steppe with reindeer hides on their backs, flint blades at their belts, children running ahead. They are lean, tall teeth, flashing in laughter, bones hardened by use but sustained by cooperation. These were not brutish figures bent under the weight of survival. They were strong, resilient humans carrying the blueprint of health we are still chasing today. The body of the Ice Age reminds us that survival was not misery alone. It was also vigor, adaptability, and the profound strength that comes from living in balance with both land and community. Around 11,700 years ago, the Great Chill finally broke. Glaciers retreated, rivers swelled with meltwater, and forests marched northward. The Pleistocene ended, and the Holocene began. Humanity stepped out of the Ice Age and into a new experiment, one that would reshape the world forever. The shift was both opportunity and upheaval. As the climate warmed, plants and animals spread into new niches. Hunters followed, but the familiar patterns of migration grew less predictable. Herds scattered, grasslands turned to woodlands. Where once reindeer stampeded in endless lines, now deer slipped quietly between trees. The rhythm of abundance faltered, forcing humans to adapt again. In the Fertile Crescent along the banks of the Euphrates and Tigris, small experiments in cultivation became commitments. Wild wheat and barley once gathered by hand were deliberately sown. Goats and sheep once hunted were penned. What had begun during the Younger Dresses as desperate innovation solidified into the Neolithic Revolution. Agriculture tethered people to land, anchoring them in villages, then towns, then cities. But every gain carried a cost. Sedentary life enabled food surpluses, but also social stratification. Burials shift from egalitarian bands, elders and children honoured alike, to elites, with ornaments, weapons and wealth piled high. Inequality, once impossible in mobile bands, took root in fields and granaries. Diseases, too, spread in crowded settlements, fueled by close proximity to livestock and poor sanitation. The robust health of hunter-gatherers gave way to new vulnerabilities, and yet something astonishing blossomed. With surplus food and settled lives came monumental architecture. At Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, 11 500-year-old stone pillars rise in circular enclosures carved with animals and symbols. This was no simple campfire gathering, but a cathedral of stone built before pottery, writing, or even farming reached their full expression. It suggests that the human urge for meaning, for ritual, story, and community was as old as survival itself, perhaps even the engine that drove agriculture forward. So what, after 40,000 years of Ice Age struggle, can we learn? 3 lessons stand out. First, adaptability as mastery. Our ancestors survived sudden freezes, vanishing megafauna and shifting landscapes, not by clinging to sameness, but by experimenting new tools, new foods, new strategies. Flexibility was their greatest strength. Second, community as technology. Bands of 30 sharing meat and memory proved stronger than any lone hunter. Compassion for the disabled, care for children, wisdom of elders, these soft skills were harder than flint, sharper than obsidian. They were what carried us forward. Third meaning is survival. Cave art, bone flutes, ornaments, rituals, these were not luxuries but lifelines. They made endurance worthwhile, wove identity across generations, and held groups together when cold and hunger might have torn them apart. When the ice ended, humanity changed forever. But the lessons of the Ice Age remain inscribed in our bodies, our myths, and our social instincts. We are still creatures of story, of sharing, of adaptability. The band may have grown into a city, the reindeer hunt into agriculture, but beneath the layers of technology and history, we are still shaped by the wisdom of the ice. So tonight, as you lie beneath blankets instead of hides, warmed by central heating instead of bone-fueled lamps, remember that you carry within you the resilience of those who painted caves, sewed furs, and sang into the dark. The Ice Age ended, but its wisdom is not gone. It lives in us, reminding us that in adaptability and community and in meaning, we find not only survival, but the possibility of thriving. Lessons of the Ice, What the Deep Past Teaches Us Now. When we trace the footsteps of Ice Age people through mammoth bone houses, firelit caves and windswept refuges, we are not simply looking at survival. We are looking at a handbook for how to live well, even in a modern world that feels at times just as harsh and uncertain. The Ice Age ended more than 11,000 years ago, but the lessons its people left us are still alive in our bones, our minds, and our communities. The first lesson is adaptability. Time and again our ancestors faced upheaval, sudden freezes like the Younger Dryas, vanishing herds, rising seas. Each time they adjusted, learning to fish, to plant seeds, to trade across vast distances. Adaptability was not weakness, but resilience. In our own age of rapid change, whether technological, environmental, or social, the same truth applies. The ability to bend without breaking, to innovate without losing heart, remains our greatest inheritance. The second lesson is community. Bands of 25 or 30 people shared food, raised children together, and cared for the injured and the elderly. Compassion was not optional, it was survival technology. Archaeological evidence shows that even the disabled and elderly lived long lives because others carried them, fed them, and valued their presence. Today, when loneliness and division often feel like epidemics, the Ice Age reminds us that no one was meant to endure alone. Bonds of trust, generosity, and care are still the surest foundation for survival and flourishing. The third lesson is meaning. Cave art, bone flutes, ornaments, and rituals were not luxuries, they were lifelines. They encoded knowledge, reinforced identity, and gave people a reason to endure another winter. Meaning made survival bearable, even beautiful. In our modern world of distraction and noise, we still need stories, art, and shared rituals to remind us who we are and why life is worth living. The fourth lesson is balance. Ice Age diets combined meat with plants, roots with berries, fish with grains. Their health was robust, their teeth strong, their bodies resilient. They lived in tune with seasons and ecosystems, drawing from diversity rather than monoculture. As we face challenges of sustainability and health today, their example calls us back to balance with land, food, and body. Finally, the deepest lesson is patience. For thousands of years, people lived in Beringia, waiting for glaciers to melt so they could enter the Americas. They endured generations of watching ice walls holding stories and hopes for futures they would never see. Their patience bore fruit when their descendants spread across continents. In an era that prizes speed, they remind us that some of the greatest journeys require waiting faith and trust in those who will follow. The Ice Age ended, but its wisdom did not. We carry it still in our adaptability, in our yearning for community, in our love of meaning, in our instinct for balance, and in our capacity for patience. Their lives whisper across millennia that resilience is not only about enduring hardship, but about finding beauty, trust, and purpose in the coldest of seasons. Thank you for sharing this quiet moment with me. Subscribe so the next stories can find their way to you as well.